Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. What if everything you were taught about human history began at the wrong chapter? Tonight, the history you are about to hear does not begin in Mesopotamia, or Egypt, or Greece. It begins much further back, in a timeline that mainstream archaeology has not fully accounted for, in the ruins of civilizations so old that their names exist only in myths that every culture on Earth independently thought worth preserving. If you have found this channel and this episode worth your time, consider subscribing and leaving a like. New episodes arrive every day, and there is a great deal more history, hidden and otherwise, still to tell. 6 civilizations rose before ours. Each one reached heights we are only beginning to measure. Each one ended, not by accident, not by slow decay, but by a specific trigger, a reset so total that the world that followed had to begin again from almost nothing. Almost. Because something always passed through, some piece of knowledge, some number cut into stone, some story told to children who told it to their children, survived every single one. We are the 7th, and the pattern that ended the previous 6 has not stopped. That story begins now, in a time so distant that even the oldest human memory cannot quite reach its edge, but reaches for it anyway, every time it dreams. Chapter 1: The World Before the First Memory. Long before the first pyramid was laid, long before the first city rose from river mud, long before any human hand pressed the first mark into wet clay and called it a record, there was already a world that had been going on for a very long time. The conventional account of human history begins somewhere around 5,000 years ago, when writing appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt close enough together that scholars still debate which came first. Push it back further, and you reach the agricultural revolution. 10,000 years ago, the first fields, the first domesticated grain. Push further still, and you reach the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, 40,000 years old, which already demonstrate an artistic sophistication that does not look like the beginning of anything. It looks like the middle. And the question that the hidden timeline insists on asking is this: the middle of what? The answer that 6 independent civilizational traditions arrived at, without contact with one another, is consistent enough to deserve more than dismissal. The Hindu Puranas describe 7 root races of humanity, of which the present humanity is the 5th subrace of the 5th, meaning that 4 complete human types preceded us, each with its own relationship to matter, to consciousness, to the physical world. The Babylonian tradition preserves 8 antediluvian kings whose combined reigns stretch across 241,200 years. The Zulu oral tradition names the Abantu Bokukala, the first people, and describes them as beings fundamentally different in nature from the humans who came after the Great Forgetting. The Hopi name 4 worlds, 3 of which have ended. The Mayan long count reaches backward into periods of time that dwarf recorded history. The Egyptian priests who spoke to Solon in the 6th century before the Common Era told him, according to Plato's account, that the Greeks were children, that Egypt itself was young compared to the civilizations whose records the Say's temple still held. 7 traditions. 7 independent memories, all of them pointing in the same direction. The first civilization did not look like a civilization in any sense the modern eye would recognize. This is important to hold at the beginning because the instinct is to imagine the first people as a rougher, simpler version of ourselves. Earlier on the same line we now occupy. The theosophical tradition, systematized by Helena Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine of 1888, drawing on sources she identified as originating in Tibetan and Sanskrit repositories, describes the first root race as non-physical in the material sense, beings of condensed energy rather than flesh, existing in a relationship with the earth that was less like habitation and more like participation. Blavatsky's account draws criticism for its unverifiability, and that criticism is fair. But the secret doctrine was not written in isolation. Its descriptions of the first and second races parallel accounts in the Hindu Puranas closely enough that the parallels require explanation, whether by common source or by independent arrival at a shared intuition about what the beginning of human consciousness might have looked like. What all these traditions agree on is the quality of the first age. It carried names across every culture: Satya Yuga in the Vedic system, the Golden Age in the Greek, the First World in the Hopi account. And in each tradition it was characterized by the same cluster of properties: clarity of awareness, harmony with natural systems, a relationship with the physical world unclouded by the density that later ages accumulated. The Vedic texts describe the Satya Yuga as a period when Dharma stood on all four of its legs, when the moral and natural order of the universe was intact and operating without friction. The duration assigned to it varies by tradition, but the consistency of its character does not. The Zulu name for the first people, Abantu Bukukala, carries within it the sense of origination, of being the ones who came at the very beginning of the human project. Their tradition describes these first people as existing in a state of direct communion with the living systems of the earth, moving through a world that was not yet fully solidified into the form it holds now. The earth itself in this telling was younger and more fluid, its land masses not yet in their current arrangement, its climate operating under conditions that geological evidence suggests were genuinely different in the deep past from anything the last several 100,000 years have produced. It was during this first age, in the tradition that runs most consistently across the widest range of cultures, that the foundational gift was given. The moment appears in different forms in different traditions, but its shape is always the same: a knowledge that was not discovered but transmitted. In the Greek account, Prometheus descends from Olympus carrying fire, not metaphorical fire, but the fire of awareness itself, the capacity to work with the natural world in a directed, intentional way that distinguishes civilization from mere survival. In the Vedic tradition, Agni is the divine fire that mediates between the human and the cosmic, the same principle made present in the physical world as a gift from a higher order of being. In the Zoroastrian tradition, Atar is the sacred fire maintained by the first righteous ones as a direct inheritance from the divine. In the Mesoamerican traditions, the first people received the knowledge of the calendar, of time itself, as a navigable system, from beings who came before them and taught them how to read what was written in the sky. These are not stories about fire in the cooking sense. They are records of a moment, preserved in myth, because myth is the most durable form of information storage the human mind has produced, in which the first civilization received an understanding of the principles underlying the physical world. The Prometheus class gift, as it appears across every tradition that remembers the first people, is always the same thing in different clothing. The knowledge of how to work with the fundamental forces of existence in a conscious, directed way. Whether that knowledge came from a higher civilization, from a non human intelligence, from a future humanity reaching backward through time, or from the internal development of the first people themselves, the traditions do not agree. What they agree on is that it was received, that it was real, and that it was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. Across the enormously long duration of the First Age, measured in Vedic calculation at 1,728,000 years, the first civilization did not stagnate. It developed. It deepened its relationship with the physical world. It became gradually more material, more capable of working with matter directly, more invested in the physical plane as a site of activity and meaning. And this process, which in the Vedic framework is called the descent into matter, was also the beginning of the end, because materiality carries weight. It carries the friction of individual perspective, of separation, of the gradual closing of the awareness that had been in the first age wide open. The first reset was not an external catastrophe in the sense that later resets would be. There was no comet, no flood, no magnetic reversal that ended the first civilization from outside. The Vedic text describe the close of the Satya Yuga as a natural transition, the weight of accumulated material existence finally exceeding what the civilization could carry in its original form. The way a fire burns lower, not because something has been thrown at it, but because the wood it was given has been consumed. The first world did not end, it transformed. It condensed further. The beings that had been luminous and vast became denser and more particular. And in becoming more particular, they became the seed of what would follow. What passed through the first reset was not a physical archive. There were no tablets, no buildings, no coded geometries cut into stone. What passed through was a pattern, the template of organized awareness, the knowledge of the gift that had been given at the beginning, held now not in external form, but in the deeper structure of what the second people would be. Every tradition that remembers the first age ends with the same image. Something essential survived, carried not in hands, but in nature itself, waiting in the new world for the second civilization to rediscover it. The number 7 appears in this context across traditions that had no documented contact with one another. 7 root races in the Vedic and Theosophical systems. 7 ages of the world in Babylonian cosmology. 7 worlds in certain strands of Jewish mysticism. 7 in the Hopi. 7 in certain Mesoamerican frameworks. 7 in the oldest layers of Egyptian temple mathematics. The number is not decoration. In every tradition where it appears in connection with civilizational cycles, it carries the same implication that the pattern has a specific shape, a specific duration, a specific number of iterations before it completes itself. 6 have come before. One is now running. The first civilization left no ruins. It left something harder to date and easier to ignore. A number, repeated across the widest possible distribution of human cultures, each of which arrived at it independently, and each of which placed it in the same position in the same story. 7 civilizations, 6 resets. And the second of those civilizations, rising from the condensed remnant of the first, would take what had passed through the first reset and do something remarkable with it. It would build, not in stone, not yet, but in something that stone would later be used to encode, and that has survived every catastrophe since. Chapter 2: The Second People and the Age of Resonance. What the first civilization left behind was not a ruin, but a residue, a compression of everything it had been, held now in the nature of the people who came after it. The way a seed holds the full architecture of a tree in a form too small to see clearly. The second civilization rose from that residue into a world that was still forming. The geological record of deep time, the period running from roughly 150 million years ago through to the epochs just before the Pleistocene, is not a record of a stable world. It is a record of a world in motion, continents drifting, seas rising and retreating, climates shifting across ranges that dwarf anything in recorded human experience. The traditions that describe the second people place them in this long, fluid middle period and describe them accordingly, as a civilization shaped by a world that had not yet settled into its current form, and that offered possibilities to its inhabitants that a more solidified earth would later withdraw. Helena Blavatsky, writing in The Secret Doctrine in 1888, described the second root race with a precision that has struck later readers as either remarkable or suspicious, depending on their disposition toward her sources. She named them the Hyperborean race, not in the Greek geographical sense of a people living beyond the north wind, but in the sense of a people living in a world whose north was not yet where north now is. The second people were, in her account, still not fully physical in the modern sense. They reproduced by a process she called budding, a division of the self that is closer to the reproductive strategy of simple organisms than to anything a human body does now. And they existed in a relationship with matter that was more cooperative than combative, more resonant than mechanical. They did not shape the physical world by force. They worked with its frequencies. The concept of resonance as a constructive technology sits so far outside the modern engineering frame that it tends to be dismissed before it is examined. But the dismissal is worth pausing over, because the evidence for something like resonant construction appears in the archaeological record at exactly the sites where conventional explanations run out of room. Göbekli Tepe's pillars, each weighing between 10 and 20 tons, were shaped from bedrock quarries up to half a kilometer away with no evidence of the wheel, the pulley, or any draft animal capable of the task. The basalt logs of Nan Madol, weighing up to 50 tons each, were transported across open ocean with no technology the archaeological record of the culture credits with their construction. The stones of Sacsayhuaman, some exceeding 200 tons, were fitted to tolerances of less than half an inch without mortar and without any tool yet recovered that could have produced those surfaces. The standard explanations: ramps, sledges, large workforces, scale adequately for some of these problems and fail completely for others. The resonance hypothesis: that certain civilizations understood how to use sound, vibration, or some related principle of frequency to temporarily alter the effective weight or cohesion of large masses, is not mainstream science, but it is what several traditions describe independently as the method of the builders who came before. The Chematics work of Hans Jenny in the 20th century demonstrated that sound frequencies applied to physical media, sand, water, powder, produce geometrically precise patterns that shift predictably as the frequency changes. The patterns Jenny documented bear a striking resemblance to the geometric ratios encoded in megalithic architecture across cultures. The same proportions, the same relationships between elements, the same underlying mathematics of wave interference. This is not proof, but it is the kind of convergence that tends to appear when a lost technology has left traces in multiple places without leaving a manual. The second civilization's relationship to frequency and resonance was, in the traditions that describe it, not primarily architectural. Architecture was the application. The foundation was something closer to what the Vedic tradition calls Nada Brahma, the universe as sound. The idea that the physical world is not fundamentally material but fundamentally vibrational, and that consciousness which understands this can work with the physical world at the level of its actual operating principle rather than at the surface level of mass and force. The second people, in this framework, did not build by moving things. They built by knowing what frequency would invite a thing to move itself. What they built, the traditions suggest, was not cities in the modern sense, but nodes, points in the landscape where the Earth's own frequencies converged, where the resonant properties of the local geology amplified what the builders brought to it. These nodes were not chosen arbitrarily. They were located by a knowledge of the Earth's energetic geography, what later traditions would call ley lines, or dragon paths, or the web of sacred sites, that mapped the living frequency structure of the planet the way an acupuncturist maps the meridian structure of a body. The second civilization did not impose its architecture on the landscape. It found the places where the landscape was already speaking, and it answered. The knowledge encoded in this work was mathematical at its root. The ratios that govern frequency, the relationships between wavelengths, the geometry of standing waves, the mathematics of resonant interference are not arbitrary. They are the same ratios that appear in the proportions of the Great Pyramid, in the spacing of Stonehenge's stones, in the ground plans of temple complexes across cultures that had no documented contact. The ratio of the Great Pyramid's perimeter to its height produces, when calculated with the original casing stones included, a value within a fraction of a percent of 2 times pi. This is not a coincidence that arises from rough approximation. It requires deliberate knowledge of pi to a precision that Greek mathematics would not formally establish for another 2,000 years after the pyramid's construction. The question is not whether the builders knew this ratio. The question is where they learned it. The answer the hidden timeline offers is that they inherited it. The mathematical ratios embedded in the architecture of the ancient world are not original discoveries made by the cultures credited with building the structures. They are transmissions, the encoded residue of the second civilization's understanding of frequency, preserved in the one language that does not require translation. Number expressed as proportion, cut into stone, built into the relationships between elements of a structure so large that the number is visible not to the eye, but only to the measuring instrument of a later civilization, patient enough to look. Blavatsky placed the second race at a remove of time so vast, approximately 150 million years, that the geological record of their civilization, if they left one, would be unrecognizable even to a trained eye. This is either a convenient unfalsifiability or an honest acknowledgement that civilizations built on resonance rather than stone leave different kinds of traces than civilizations built on stone. The second civilization's ruins, if the tradition is accurate, are not ruins in the architectural sense. They are the frequencies themselves, the nodes in the Earth's energetic geography that later civilizations kept finding and kept building on, not always knowing why this particular hilltop, this particular river bend, this particular alignment of sight lines felt like the right place to build a temple. The second reset came from above. The Vedic texts describe it in the imagery of seven suns burning simultaneously, a period of catastrophic solar output that scorched the surface of the world and disrupted the resonant systems on which the second civilization's technology depended. The geomagnetic interpretation of this tradition places it as a period of extreme solar activity combined with a weakening of the Earth's magnetic field, the same combination that the Van Allen belts currently show early signs of approaching. Without the magnetic shield that normally deflects the bulk of the solar wind, the frequencies the second civilization had learned to work with became noise. The nodes went dark. The knowledge that had been operational became, for the survivors, theoretical, something known but no longer practicable in a world whose energetic geography had been scrambled. What the survivors carried through the second reset was the mathematics, not the practice. The practice required a stable energetic environment to function. But the ratios, the proportions, the relationships between frequencies that described how the system worked, could be encoded in something that did not depend on the Earth's magnetic stability to survive. Geometry. The transition from the resonance technology of the second civilization to the geometric encoding of the third is the reason that the world's oldest architectural traditions share a mathematical vocabulary that precedes any of them. The geometry came first. The buildings came later, as a vessel for the geometry, a way of keeping the numbers alive in physical form until the world stabilized enough for the practice they described to be recovered. The second reset did not erase everything. It never does. What it erased was the operational capacity, the ability to do what the knowledge described. What it preserved, in the people who came through it, was the knowledge itself, encoded in proportion, in number, in the mathematical relationships of a universe that runs on frequency whether or not any civilization is currently capable of working with that fact. Those survivors moved southward in the traditions that track their migrations, away from the scorched northern regions toward the great body of water that then occupied a much larger portion of the southern hemisphere than it does now. They were not fleeing into emptiness. They were moving toward the place where the third civilization was already beginning to take shape, a world of islands and warm water, and a different relationship to the living systems of the earth than anything the Second Age had known. That world had a name, and the name has lasted long enough that we still argue about whether it was real. Chapter 3: Lemuria and the Pacific Memory. The Pacific Ocean is not empty. This is the first thing to understand about it, and the thing that the map most consistently fails to communicate, because a map renders the Pacific as a blue absence, a vast nothing between the edges of other, more storied continents. But the Pacific is the largest geographic feature on the surface of the Earth, covering more than 30% of the planet, and scattered across it in patterns that do not look random are more than 25,000 islands, many of them bearing evidence of construction, of astronomical alignment, of architectural ambition that sits in profound and unresolved tension with what is known about the cultures credited with building them. Nan Madol sits in the Caroline Islands of present-day Micronesia, and it is one of the strangest places on Earth. Built on 92 artificial islets in a tidal lagoon off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, it was constructed using basalt logs, columnar basalt, naturally hexagonal in cross-section, quarried from sites on the other side of the island, each log weighing between 5 and 50 tons. The total mass of stone used in Nan Madol's construction has been estimated at 750,000 metric tons. The local tradition says the city was built by twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olosipa, who used magic to fly the stones into place. Mainstream archaeology, which does not accept the sorcerers, has not produced a satisfying alternative. The current leading hypothesis involves rafts and a large organized workforce, which accounts for the will to build but not for the physics of moving 50-ton basalt columns across open water on a raft without losing them to the ocean. Nan Madol was not built by a primitive culture doing something simple. It was built by someone who knew something about moving very large things that the archaeological record of the region does not otherwise contain. Easter Island's moai face inward. This detail, small and easy to pass over, is worth holding. The nearly 900 stone figures that stand on the island's coastal platforms do not face the sea. They face the interior of the island, watching over a land that is now mostly grassland and volcanic rock. But Easter Island was not always grassland. Its original Polynesian name, Tepito o Tehenua, means the navel of the world, not the edge of a world, not an outpost, but a center. The Moai were not built by a people on the margin of something. They were built by a people who believed they stood at the middle of something, watching over a territory that extended further than the ocean around them suggests. The direction of their gaze, inward, toward a center, across land rather than water, may be the oldest map of a world that is no longer there. These are the remnants, the scattered high ground of what the third civilization called home. Lemuria, also recorded as Mu in the tradition systematized by James Churchward, was not a small island chain. In the accounts that preserve its geography, it was a continent, occupying a significant portion of the Pacific basin, stretching from what is now the Hawaiian archipelago in the north to what is now Fiji and Tonga in the south, from the coast of what is now the Americas in the east to what is now the islands of the Philippines and Indonesia in the west. Its highest points are still visible, the peaks of submarine mountain ranges that break the surface as Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. Its valleys and plains and river systems are under 2 to 4,000 meters of water. James Churchward came to the story of Mu not through theory, but through what he described as a direct encounter with its records. A British Army officer serving in India in the 1870s, Churchward claimed that a temple priest, recognizing in him something worth trusting, showed him a collection of ancient clay tablets written in a script the priest called Nakal, the sacred language of the original civilization. The priest spent years teaching Churchward to read the tablets. What Churchward read, over those years in a monastery whose location he never fully disclosed, was a history, the history of a civilization called Mu that had existed in the Pacific for tens of thousands of years before a geological catastrophe carried it beneath the ocean. He spent the following decades cross-referencing what the tablets described against every other ancient tradition he could locate: the Hindu Vedas, the Mayan codices, the Egyptian sacred texts, the Babylonian records, and published his findings in 1926 as The Lost Continent of Mu. The cross-references Churchward found were not superficial. The creation narratives of the traditions he examined described the same sequence of events in the same order. The cosmological symbols, the sun disk, the lotus flower, the serpent, the tree of life, appeared in traditions that had no documented contact, rendered in the same relationships to one another, assigned the same meanings. The number sequences embedded in the oldest sacred mathematics of Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica resolved, when decoded through the Nakal framework Churchward had learned, to the same original source document. He did not claim to have proven the existence of Mu. He claimed to have found more independent confirmations of it than any single theory about a lost civilization had a right to expect. The Lemurian civilization was organized around principles that were the complement of the Second Age's resonance technology, where the second people had worked with frequency as a constructive force. The Lemurian civilization worked with what might be called biological intelligence, an understanding of the living systems of the earth, so thorough that it functioned as a technology in its own right. The Lemurian tradition, as preserved in the esoteric sources that Blavatsky and Churchward drew from independently, describes a culture organized around feminine principles of cyclical knowing, around the rhythms of the moon, the tides, the seasons, the magnetic pulses of the earth itself. Lemurian architecture, where it is described at all, was grown as much as built. Structures that worked with the living landscape rather than imposing upon it. that used the natural properties of living wood, of volcanic stone, of water in motion, in ways that required intimate knowledge of those materials' own tendencies. This orientation toward the living and the cyclical left a different kind of record than the geometric encoding of the Second Age, where the second civilization preserved its knowledge in mathematical proportion. The Lemurian civilization preserved its knowledge in the body, in ceremony, in agricultural practice, in the oral traditions of people whose memory was trained to a precision that literate cultures have largely lost. The Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime is the most complete surviving example of this kind of preservation. The Dreamtime is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is a navigational and ecological database encoded in story and ceremony, preserving accurate information about the geography, biology, and history of the Australian continent across a span of time that mainstream archaeology now accepts as at least 65,000 years. The songlines, the routes through the landscape encoded in specific songs whose words describe landmarks, have been verified against the actual landscape and found accurate. The stories of Dreamtime sea level changes have been verified against the geological record of Australian coastal inundation. The Dreamtime is not a primitive people's attempt to explain the world. It is a civilization's archive, stored in the most durable medium available, human memory, reinforced by ceremony, passed through an unbroken chain of deliberate transmission. The third reset was not sudden. This distinguishes it from most of what followed, and it is worth understanding because the nature of a reset shapes the kind of survival it permits. The Lemurian subsidence was geological, a slow process, measured in centuries rather than days, by which the tectonic plates underlying the Pacific basin shifted and the land they supported descended. Islands became shallower, coastlines retreated. The rivers that had run from the highlands of Mu's interior to its shores grew shorter as those highlands became the new shores and then became the new seafloor. The process was slow enough that a civilization organized around biological intelligence, around reading the signals of living systems, would have recognized what was happening long before it became catastrophic. The Lemurians, the tradition suggests, did not flee. They migrated. Deliberately, in organized waves, carrying their seeds and their ceremonies and their knowledge of the living world to every shore that the subsiding Pacific could reach. East, they moved into what is now Polynesia. The Maori tradition of New Zealand preserves memories of a homeland called Hawaii that lies to the northeast, in the direction of the open Pacific, submerged. North, into the islands of Japan, where the Jomon culture, the oldest continuous pottery tradition on Earth, dating to at least 16,000 years ago, carries aesthetic and ceremonial elements that parallel Lemurian descriptions in ways that conventional archaeology has not fully addressed. West, into the Indian subcontinent, where the Dravidian cultures of the south preserve traditions of a lost land called Kumari Kandam that once extended far into what is now the Indian Ocean. South, into Australia, where the Aboriginal traditions explicitly describe a time when the land was larger, when the sea was further away, when the world that existed before the water came was the world that the Dreamtime remembers. And in each of these places, the Lemurian migrants arrived not as refugees, but as carriers, bringing the knowledge of cyclical systems, of biological intelligence, of the living Earth's own patterns, into cultures that would preserve it in the most durable form available. The ceremony told to children, the song walked into the landscape. The agricultural practice carried in the hands of people who knew exactly what they were keeping alive and why. The third reset was the longest dying of any civilization in this chronicle. But what it preserved was also the most widely distributed, scattered across every shore the Pacific touches, held in traditions that have survived not because they were written in stone, but because they were lived, season by season, generation by generation, in the bodies and ceremonies of people who understood that the knowledge they carried was not theirs to keep. It was theirs to pass on. What the Lemurian survivors brought west into the older and more geologically stable land masses of the Atlantic basin would eventually contribute to a civilization of a very different character, one that built not in ceremony but in stone, not in biological rhythm but in mathematical precision, not in the wisdom of the living world but in the architecture of a world it intended to master. That civilization rose from an island in the Atlantic that Plato spent two dialogues insisting was not a myth. And the question of whether he was right has never been more open than it is now. Chapter 4: Atlantis and the Architecture of the Fourth Age. Stone tells a different story than ceremony. Where the Lemurian civilization preserved its knowledge in the living memory of people and the biological rhythms of a world it moved through rather than over, the fourth civilization built in material that was meant to outlast memory entirely, meant to survive not just the death of the people who made it, but the death of the language those people spoke, the death of the culture that gave the building its meaning, the death of the civilization itself. The fourth civilization built for permanence in the most literal sense. It built for a future it knew it would not inhabit, and it built well enough that the future found what it left. That civilization was Atlantis. And before dismissing the name, before allowing the accumulated weight of fantasy novels and pseudo-documentaries and New Age appropriation to close the door on it, it is worth returning to the original source, because the original source is more careful, more specific, and more insistent on its own credibility than the popular version of the story has ever acknowledged. Plato wrote about Atlantis twice. The first account appears in the Timaeus, composed around 360 BCE, and the second in the Critias, written shortly after. In both texts, Plato goes out of his way to distinguish the account from the allegorical myths he uses elsewhere. He names his sources with a specificity that his other myths do not require. The story came to Critias from his grandfather, also named Critias, who had heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, who had received it during his travels in Egypt from the priests of the temple at Sais, who told Solon that their records preserved the history of events 9,000 years before his visit. Solon's visit to Egypt is historically attested. The priests of Sais were historically renowned for the depth and accuracy of their records. Plato was not a careless thinker. He knew the difference between a story used to illustrate a philosophical point and a historical account presented as fact, and he presented the Atlantis account as the latter. The chain of transmission is itself worth sitting with as a miniature of how knowledge survives catastrophe. Solon heard the account in approximately 590 BCE from priests who had kept it in their records for 9,000 years, which places the events they described at approximately 9600 BCE, a date that falls with a precision that has struck many researchers as too exact to be coincidental, immediately before the end of the Younger Dryas. The priests told Solon that the Greeks had no memory of these events because Greece had been repeatedly depopulated by catastrophes that forced each new wave of inhabitants to begin civilization from scratch, leaving only the illiterate survivors who lost the records. Egypt, protected by its geography and its institutional continuity, had kept what Greece had lost. The Atlantis account was not, in the priest's telling, a legend. It was a historical record that had survived because Egypt's record-keeping institutions had survived. What Plato's sources described was a civilization of extraordinary material achievement. Atlantis occupied a landmass in the Atlantic basin, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, in the open ocean, larger, Plato's account specified, than Libya and Asia combined. Its capital city was a feat of urban engineering whose description reads less like ancient mythology and more like the work of a civilization that had solved problems of hydraulics, material science, and urban planning at a level that the ancient world otherwise shows no evidence of having approached. The city was built on concentric rings, alternating bands of land and water, three of each, surrounding a central island on which stood the primary temple and the palace of the ruling family. The rings were connected by canals wide enough for ships, the outermost ring connected to the sea by a channel 11 kilometers long. The central island, where the original temple to Poseidon stood, was covered in a metal called orichalcum, described as second in value only to gold, reddish in color, mined in the mountains of Atlantis, which clad the walls of the inner city and caught the light of the sun in a way that made the city visible from the sea. Orichalcum has been a source of particular interest because it is not clearly fictional. In 2015, a shipwreck off the coast of Sicily yielded 39 ingots of an alloy whose composition, approximately 75 to 80% copper, with zinc and traces of nickel, lead, and iron, matches the description Plato gives for orichalcum more closely than any other known ancient material. The shipwreck dates to the 6th century BCE, contemporary with Solon's visit to Egypt. The ingots were being transported somewhere. Where they were being transported from and where the mine that produced them was located remains unknown. The Atlantean civilization's technology, in the accounts that preserve it beyond Plato, in the Hermetic tradition, in certain strands of Egyptian sacred knowledge, in the traditions that Blavatsky identified as originating in the same Tibetan and Sanskrit repositories she drew on for the root race history, centered on the use of crystals as energy focusing and energy transmitting devices. The great crystal at the center of the Atlantean temple complex was not decorative. It gathered solar and cosmic energy and distributed it through a network of smaller relay stones positioned across the Atlantean landmass and eventually across the broader Atlantic world, powering the civilization's technology in a way that left no combustion, no waste, no visible mechanism that a later civilization looking at its ruins would recognize as an energy system. This is why the Atlantean ruins, in whatever form they survive on the Atlantic seafloor, do not look like a power grid. The power grid was the crystal network, and crystals, unlike iron and copper, do not survive 12,000 years of ocean floor chemistry in a form that announces what they were. The Azores Plateau sits at roughly 2,000 meters below the Atlantic surface, west of Portugal and the Canary Islands, on the mid-Atlantic ridge. The geology of the Azores is anomalous. The islands that break the surface are volcanic, consistent with ridge geology, but the plateau itself shows evidence of having been above water within geologically recent time. Sand, which forms only in shallow water or on exposed beaches, has been recovered from the Azores Plateau at depths where no current geological model predicts it should exist. The mid-Atlantic ridge is the most volcanically active geological feature on the ocean floor. If the Atlantic basin once contained a landmass of the size Plato described, the ridge is where the seismic and volcanic activity that destroyed it would have been centered, and the ridge is exactly where Plato's account places Atlantis. The fourth reset combined forces that no single mechanism fully captures. The geomagnetic instability that had been building since the third reset, the same instability that the Lemurian survivors had fled, reached a threshold in the Atlantic basin that triggered a sequence. Seismic destabilization along the mid-Atlantic ridge, volcanic activity at a scale that altered the regional climate within years, and a final submersion event that the priests of Sais described to Solon as occurring in a single terrible night and day. Geological processes do not usually work in single days, but the collapse of a destabilized landmass into an already active seismic zone can produce the kind of sudden, catastrophic change that human memory compresses into a single terrible night. The way a slow illness becomes, in the telling, a sudden death, because the moment of the final collapse is the moment that memory fixes on. The Atlantean survivors did not scatter randomly. The tradition is consistent across sources. They went where they had already established outposts, colonies, and trading relationships, places where Atlantean knowledge had been seeding local cultures for centuries before the final catastrophe. Egypt received the largest and most organized group. The Yucatan received another. The British Isles received a third, which is why Stonehenge's mathematical encoding mirrors the Giza Plateau's mathematical encoding in ways that conventional archaeology explains as independent parallel development, and the hidden timeline explains as common origin. The Indus Valley received survivors who would eventually contribute to the Vedic tradition's preservation of the root race history. The Canary Islands, which sit directly on the Azores Plateau, received the Guanche people, a culture whose mummification practices, their step pyramid structures, and their blood type distribution are all anomalous for their geographic position in ways that make more sense as the remnant population of a drowned Atlantic civilization than as an isolated island culture that developed those features independently. In each of these places, the Atlantean survivors arrived with knowledge and with authority, the authority of people who had come from somewhere larger, somewhere more developed, somewhere now gone. They became the teacher caste of the civilizations they entered, the priest astronomers of early Egypt, the astronomer priests of early Mesoamerica, the druidic tradition of the British Isles, the rishi class of early Vedic India. They did not hide what they knew. They encoded it in temple proportions, in astronomical alignments, in the mathematics of sacred architecture, in forms designed to outlast the cultures that received them, because they had already seen what happened when a civilization's knowledge was not preserved in durable form. The fourth civilization was the most thoroughly material of the six predecessors, and its fall was the most thoroughly remembered, because materiality leaves traces that later materiality can recognize. But the civilization that followed Atlantis, the one that built on the Giza Plateau before the Younger Dryas, that encoded the accumulated knowledge of four predecessor civilizations into the proportions of structures built to last across multiple cycles, was guided by a figure whose name appears in more traditions, across more cultures, in more roles than any other single carrier of antediluvian knowledge. That figure did not merely survive the next reset, he prepared for it. And what he buried in the stone of the Giza Plateau may still be waiting to be found. Chapter 5: Thoth and the Library Buried in Stone. He appears in the Egyptian tradition as Thoth, the ibis-headed keeper of sacred knowledge, the inventor of writing, the measurer of time, the one who weighed the heart of the dead against the feather of truth and recorded the outcome. He appears in the Greek tradition as Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice greatest, the author of a body of philosophical and technical knowledge so vast and so internally consistent that Renaissance scholars who recovered it in the 15th century concluded, incorrectly but understandably, that it must predate both Plato and Moses. He appears in the Hebrew tradition as Enoch, the man who walked with God and was taken, who did not die but was translated directly into a higher order of existence, who wrote 366 books before his departure and left them as an inheritance for his children. He appears in the Islamic tradition as Idris, the prophet of wisdom, the first to write with a pen, the one taken up before the flood to preserve what the flood would otherwise have destroyed. In the Sumerian tradition, he is Ningish Siddha. In certain strands of the Mesoamerican tradition, he is Quetzalcoatl in his aspect as the wind that carries knowledge across water. The same figure, different names, different iconographies, different cultural framings, but the same essential description underneath all of them: a man, or a being in human form, of extraordinary knowledge and extraordinary longevity, who lived in the age before the great catastrophe, who foresaw what was coming, and who spent the time before it arrived ensuring that what had been built across four civilizational cycles would not be lost in the fifth reset. This is not the coincidence it might appear to be. Traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years do not independently invent the same figure with the same characteristics and the same historical position. At the hinge between the pre-catastrophe world and the post-catastrophe world, carrying knowledge across the gap, unless the figure corresponds to something real. The real thing need not have been a single individual. It may have been a class of people, a lineage, a school of knowledge preservers who took the name and the role as a title rather than a personal identity. The way the Egyptian pharaoh was always Horus, regardless of the individual body that held the office. But the function was real. Someone, in the period before the Younger Dryas impact, understood what was coming and made deliberate choices about what to preserve and how to preserve it. The fifth civilization was the synthesis, where the first had existed in luminous non-materiality. The second had worked with resonant frequency. The third had cultivated biological intelligence, and the fourth had built in stone and crystal for material mastery. The fifth drew on all of these inheritances simultaneously and produced something that no single predecessor civilization had achieved. It produced a unified knowledge system that integrated the mathematical encoding of the second age, the living systems understanding of the third, and the material precision of the fourth into a single architectonic language. The result was the Giza Plateau, not the tourist destination of the present, stripped of its original casing stones and robbed of its inner chamber's contents, but the original complex as it stood before the Younger Dryas, a precision instrument built at planetary scale. This complex encoded in its dimensions, its alignments, and its internal geometry a compendium of knowledge about the Earth, the solar system, and the mathematical principles underlying both. The water erosion on the Sphinx's enclosure walls is the most durable piece of physical evidence for the fifth civilization's timeline. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, presented his analysis of the erosion patterns at the Geological Society of America's 1991 annual meeting and has continued to refine it in the decades since. The argument is straightforward. The vertical erosion channels cut into the limestone walls of the Sphinx enclosure are consistent with prolonged rainfall, heavy, sustained precipitation acting on the stone over centuries. The problem is that Egypt has not experienced the climate necessary to produce that kind of rainfall since at least 7000 BCE, and more probably since before 9000 BCE. The Sphinx enclosure's erosion pattern is not consistent with the wind and sand erosion that dominates the Giza Plateau's other surfaces. Something wet made those channels over a long period of time in a climate that no longer exists. The geological evidence places the Sphinx's construction, or at minimum, the construction of the enclosure in which it sits, in a period before 7000 BCE, and possibly as far back as 10,000 to 12,000 BCE. That range places the Sphinx in the fifth civilization's operational period, in the world before the Younger Dryas impact event, when Egypt still received the rainfall of a greener, wetter North Africa. The Giza Plateau, in that world, was not a desert monument. It was a living complex, maintained and used by a civilization that understood its function. It was not a tomb or a monument to royal ego, but an archive built in the most permanent medium available, precision cut limestone, oriented to the stars, proportioned to the mathematics of the earth itself. The Hall of Records tradition holds that beneath the Sphinx, beneath the left paw, in the most specific versions of the account, lies a chamber containing the accumulated knowledge of the civilization that built it. The tradition appears in the Hermetic texts, in certain readings of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in the Edgar Cayce readings of the 1930s and 1940s, and in the oral traditions of certain Egyptian priestly lineages that claimed unbroken descent from the original builders. Seismic surveys conducted in the 1990s by researchers including the Florida State University team and the Egyptian-Japanese Joint Survey did detect anomalies beneath the Sphinx, cavities, passages, spaces that the solid rock should not contain. The Egyptian authorities have not permitted excavation of these anomalies. The official position is that the surveys are inconclusive. The alternative position is that something is there and that the question of what it contains is complicated enough that the answer has not been permitted to become public. Thoth, in whatever form, individual or collective, the name represents, understood the Younger Dryas' impact before it arrived. The comet fragmentation event proposed by Richard Firestone and his colleagues in their 2007 paper describes a scenario in which a fragmented comet crossed the North American ice sheet at approximately 10,900 BCE. This event triggered simultaneous fire across much of the northern hemisphere, the destabilization of the Laurentide ice sheet, and the catastrophic drainage of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic. This drainage disrupted the ocean circulation that kept the northern hemisphere's climate stable, beginning a 1,000-year winter that would end the fifth civilization as thoroughly as the Atlantic submersion had ended the fourth. The physical evidence for this event is distributed across 4 continents: a layer of nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and iridium, materials associated with cosmic impact, found at the same stratigraphic level at more than 50 sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all dating to approximately 10,900 BCE. The fifth civilization would have seen it coming. A civilization with the astronomical knowledge encoded in the Giza Plateau's stellar alignments would have had the mathematical tools to calculate the orbital trajectory of an incoming body. These alignments point backward to the sky as it appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE, a date that researchers including Robert Bauval have identified as the Orion correlation's precise historical anchor. The question is not whether Thoth knew. The question is what he did with the knowledge. What he did, the tradition says, was build, not frantically, not in the months before impact, but over the long decades of the fifth civilization's final flourishing, a deliberate, organized, encyclopedic project of encoding everything that had been accumulated across 5 civilizational cycles. The dimensions of the Great Pyramid encode the circumference of the Earth at the equator, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, the mathematical constant pi, the mathematical constant phi, and the precessional cycle of the equinoxes, 25,920 years, all simultaneously, in the same structure, using the same measurements. This is not the work of a civilization that stumbled onto these numbers. It is the work of a civilization that already knew all of them and was writing them into stone. They understood that the age of knowing them was ending, and the age of rediscovering them was about to begin. The Emerald Tablet, the most compressed and most reproduced document in the Western esoteric tradition, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, appeared in its first known written form in an Arabic text of the 6th to 8th century CE. The text claims a much older origin, and the Hermetic tradition maintained that the tablet was recovered, translated from a source document of enormous antiquity, found in a vault or a hidden chamber by a figure whose discovery always has the same character. It was not original composition, but recovery, not invention, but translation of something already ancient when found. The tablet's content is consistent with this origin. It is not a philosophical essay in the style of any period it could plausibly have been composed in. It is a compressed technical document, a summary of a complete knowledge system, written in the language of someone who had too little time and too little space to write it fully, and who was writing for an audience that would need the key more than the full text. Thoth prepared for what was coming with the precision of a man who had already seen it happen before. He carried in his knowledge the memory of the previous 4 resets and understood that the 5th would follow the same pattern: catastrophe, compression, survival, rebuilding. The archive he left in the Giza Plateau was not a library in the modern sense, with texts on shelves that anyone could retrieve and read. It was a library in the deeper sense, knowledge encoded in a form that could only be decoded by a civilization that had developed the mathematical and astronomical capacity to read it. This civilization would not exist until the rebuilding after the reset was well advanced. The pyramid was not built for the people of the 5th civilization. It was built for us. And then the sky changed. The Younger Dryas impact arrived not as a single strike, but as a fragmented barrage, a comet that had broken apart somewhere in the inner solar system and arrived at Earth as a dispersed field of impactors rather than a single object. The North American ice sheet received the largest concentration. The resulting fires spread across the continent within days. The meltwater from the destabilized Laurentide ice sheet drained into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean circulation that kept the climate stable, triggering within years the onset of the cold period that would last for 12 centuries. The sky over Egypt darkened with ash and altered with the changing ocean currents. The rains that had kept the Nile Valley green and the Sphinx enclosure wet slowed, thinned, and eventually ceased. The 5th civilization, watching its climate shift and its agricultural systems fail, contracted. Its population retreated, its institutional memory compressed, its knowledge passing from the wide public understanding of a functioning civilization to the narrow custodianship of a surviving priestly lineage. What that lineage preserved, and what they eventually shared with Solon, was enough for Plato to write down. What they built into the Giza Plateau may be enough for a civilization patient and humble enough to read it, if it looks in the right places. and if it asks the right questions of the stone. But the fifth civilization was not the last before us. One more rose in the long shadow of the younger Dryas winter, and it built at a scale that still defies explanation. It left behind, in the most deliberate act of preservation in this entire chronicle, a message so carefully buried that it took 11,000 years and a German archaeologist with a shovel to find it. Chapter 6: The Giants and the Magnetic Sky. Institutions carry knowledge differently than individuals do. An individual forgets, misremembers, embellishes, and dies. An institution, a priesthood, a mystery school, a lineage of initiated knowledge keepers can maintain information across centuries with a fidelity that no single human life permits. Because the institution's memory is distributed across many minds and reinforced by ceremony, by initiation, by the structured repetition of a curriculum. It is designed specifically to resist the entropy that time applies to everything unprotected. The fifth civilization's surviving priestly lineages understood this. What they passed into the world that emerged from the younger Dryas winter was not raw knowledge, but institutional knowledge. Knowledge embedded in practices, in hierarchies, in systems of transmission designed to outlast the individuals doing the transmitting. Those institutions met in the world after the younger Dryas, a civilization already in progress. Because the sixth civilization had not waited for the fifth survivors to arrive before beginning its own work. It had been building in the highlands of Anatolia, in the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, in the mountain passes of the Andes, and the high plateaus of Bolivia. This building happened during the same centuries that the younger Dryas winter was closing down what remained of the Fifth Age. It built not in the mathematical precision of the Giza tradition, but in something rawer and more massive. Stone at a scale that communicated not refinement, but authority. Not calculation, but the confidence of beings who move through the physical world without the ordinary friction that the physical world imposes on ordinary human bodies. The sixth civilization was the civilization of the giants. This requires immediate clarification because the word giant has been so thoroughly colonized by mythology and fantasy. Its appearance in a serious historical account tends to trigger the wrong frame of reference entirely. The giants of the historical and scriptural traditions were not the cartoon figures of later legend, 50-foot beings stomping through forests. They were people of extraordinary physical scale by the standards of ordinary human anatomy, 7 feet, 8 feet, in the most extreme accounts, 10 or 12 feet in height, with a skeletal and muscular density that gave them the capacity to work with stone at a scale that ordinary human bodies cannot. The scriptural records are specific. Genesis chapter 6 names the Nephilim from the Hebrew nephil, meaning to fall, or the fallen ones. It describes them as the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, beings of great physical power who filled the earth in the period before the flood. Numbers chapter 13 names the Anakim as a specific tribe of giants encountered by the Israelite scouts in Canaan. It describes the scouts as feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. 2 Samuel names Goliath of Gath at 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet and 9 inches, by the standard cubit measurement. He is identified as one of the Rephaim, a named lineage of giant warriors that the text treats as a recognized category of being rather than an anomaly. These are not poetic exaggerations in their original context. The scriptural authors who recorded them were writing within living cultural memory of a world in which such beings existed. They were treating them with the matter of fact specificity that real historical figures receive in historical texts. The Anakim had named cities. The Rephaim had a named king, Og of Bashan, whose iron bed, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, was still on display in Rabbah. It was recorded at the time of Deuteronomy's composition as a verifiable artifact rather than a legend. The physical evidence has been complicated by a history of hoaxes that has made legitimate researchers reluctant to engage with it seriously. But the legitimate evidence exists. Oversized skeletal remains, femurs, skulls, jawbones, have been reported from excavations across North America, the Middle East, and South America in numbers too large to dismiss. The Smithsonian Institution's record of receiving and then losing or reclassifying many of the most significant finds has become its own controversy. The Paracas skulls of Peru, elongated crania whose volume exceeds that of a normal human skull by 30%, show a structural difference from normal human cranial anatomy. These have been DNA tested, and the results, published by researcher Brian Forster, showed mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal genetic database. The implications of that finding have not been absorbed by mainstream science. They have been noted, filed, and not followed up on. The Book of Enoch provides the most detailed account of the sixth civilization's character and its relationship to the knowledge traditions of the fifth. Written in Aramaic and preserved most completely in the Ethiopian Orthodox scriptural canon, the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, 200 beings who descended to earth on Mount Hermon and took human wives, producing the Nephilim as their offspring. The Watchers are described as having taught humanity the arts and sciences of civilization. Azazel taught metallurgy and the manufacture of weapons and ornaments. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Serachiel taught the signs of the moon. Kokabeel taught astronomy. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Penemu taught writing. Each watcher brought a specific technical knowledge, and the list, taken as a whole, describes exactly the curriculum of a civilization transmitting its knowledge base. The human cultures it was working alongside were being taught the way the Atlantean survivors had transmitted their knowledge to early Egypt and early Mesoamerica. The sixth civilization built at 3 sites whose architecture has never been satisfactorily explained by the tools and techniques available to the credited cultures. Göbekli Tepe stands in the highlands of southeastern Anatolia, 12 kilometers northeast of the city of Sanliurfa in present-day Turkey. Its oldest layer, Layer 3, the layer that contains the large T-shaped limestone pillars, has been carbon dated to approximately 9,600 to 8,200 BCE. This makes it the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth by several thousand years. The pillars of Layer 3 stand up to 6 meters tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons each. They are arranged in circles, facing inward toward two larger central pillars, and they are carved, covered in bas relief images of animals, insects, abstract symbols, and on the central pillars, stylized human arms, hands, and belts. This suggests the pillars themselves represent beings rather than merely structures. The site covers an area of at least 90,000 square meters, of which less than 5% has been excavated. What has been excavated has overturned the foundational assumption of the standard archaeological narrative that monumental architecture follows agriculture. That settled populations produce surplus, which produces the organizational capacity for large building projects. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture by at least 1,000 years. Whatever built it was not a farming community with surplus resources. It was something else. Klaus Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe in 1994, drawn by the results of a survey conducted by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University in 1963. The survey had noted the presence of worked flint on a hilltop and dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked at the same hilltop and recognized something that the 1963 survey had missed. The mounds were not natural. They were the buried remains of structures, covered not by the accumulation of time, but deliberately, filled in with clean rubble, the kind of intentional infill that says not this has been abandoned, but this has been archived. He spent the rest of his life excavating it. He died in 2014, having uncovered less than a tenth of what the geophysical surveys suggested was there, and having never answered the question he spent 20 years asking, who built this and why did they bury it? Puma Punku sits at an altitude of 3,800 meters on the Bolivian Altiplano, adjacent to the larger Tiwanaku complex. Its H-shaped diorite blocks represent a level of precision stoneworking that has no parallel in the ancient world. It exists outside of the most refined Egyptian temple work, and in some respects exceeds it. The H-blocks are identical to one another within tolerances of less than a millimeter. They contain interior angles that are geometrically perfect. They are drilled with holes whose interiors are smooth and whose edges are sharp in a way that requires a rotary cutting tool operating at high speed. The Tiwanaku culture, dated to between 500 and 900 CE in its most developed form, is not credited with possessing this technology. The stone itself, diorite and red sandstone, was quarried from sources 10 to 90 kilometers away. It was transported to a site at nearly 4,000 meters altitude, in a landscape that standard transportation technologies cannot adequately account for. Sacsayhuaman overlooks the city of Cusco in the Peruvian highlands, and its walls contain stones that weigh up to 200 tons. These are the largest of any ancient construction in the Americas, and among the largest of any construction anywhere on Earth. The stones are fitted together without mortar in a polygonal jigsaw pattern, each stone shaped to interlock with its neighbors on multiple faces simultaneously. This is done to tolerances of less than half an inch. The Inca, who occupied Sacsayhuaman when the Spanish arrived, told the Spanish that they had not built it. They said it had been built by a race of giants called the Viracochas, who had lived in the world before theirs. They had fitted the stones using a plant whose juice softened the rock temporarily, allowing it to be shaped and then rehardened in place. The Spanish recorded this account as mythology. It remains the most coherent explanation of the jointing that has been offered by any source. The sixth reset was geomagnetic. Not a single sudden event, but a progressive collapse. The kind of slow failure that a civilization sophisticated enough to monitor the Earth's magnetic field would have watched developing over decades. The final threshold was eventually crossed. The magnetic field that protects the Earth's surface from cosmic radiation is generated by the movement of molten iron in the outer core. It has reversed its polarity multiple times in the geological record, the north magnetic pole becoming the south becoming the north. This includes a transitional period during which the field weakens dramatically before re-establishing itself in the new orientation. During that transitional period, the Van Allen belts thin and fragment. The toroidal regions of magnetically trapped radiation that normally absorb the worst of the solar wind fail to protect the surface. And the surface of the Earth receives levels of cosmic radiation that the biosphere is not designed to absorb continuously. The sixth civilization's energy systems depended on the stability of the Earth's magnetic field for their operation. Whatever they were, and the magnetic resonance hypothesis fits the evidence better than any conventional alternative. As the field weakened, those systems failed. The agriculture that had developed in the centuries after the Younger Dryas winter ended was disrupted by the increased cosmic ray flux. This affects cloud formation and therefore precipitation in ways that climate scientists are still working to fully model. The tectonic stability that had made the Bolivian altiplano and the Anatolian highlands viable sites for monumental construction deteriorated. The magnetic field's influence on the movement of the outer core changed the stress patterns in the overlying crust. The sixth civilization did not end in a single night. It ended over centuries of progressive system failure. Technology ceased to function. Agriculture became unreliable. The great building projects became impossible to sustain. The giants themselves becoming fewer and finally absent from the record. And the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew it was coming. This is the most remarkable thing about the site, not its age or its scale. It is the fact that it was deliberately buried. Around 8000 BCE, the people who maintained Göbekli Tepe filled it in. They brought clean rubble, not the accumulated debris of habitation and abandonment. They specifically sourced clean fill and they packed it into the enclosures, covering the pillars and burying the carvings. They sealed the structures under a man-made hill that would protect them from whatever was coming. They did not abandon the site. They archived it. They treated it the way a librarian treats a rare book when the library is under threat, not discarding it, but wrapping it carefully. They put it somewhere safe, in the expectation that someone would come looking for it later. That someone came looking in 1994. Klaus Schmidt found what they had buried and spent his life uncovering it. He died before he could read all of it. But the archive is still there, still mostly buried, still mostly unread. waiting with the patience of something that has already survived 11,000 years and is in no particular hurry. What the sixth civilization's builders put into that archive is a question that the ongoing excavation has only begun to approach. What is already clear is that the astronomical alignments of Göbekli Tepe's structures encode specific star configurations corresponding to approximately 10,000 BCE. Certain carvings on the central pillars appear to describe the Younger Dryas impact event itself, a comet fragmentation rendered in the visual language of a civilization that had watched it happen. They wanted to make sure the next civilization knew what to look for in the sky. The sixth civilization left its archive in stone, buried it against the coming darkness, and waited. The darkness came. The magnetic sky that had powered its technology failed. The giants who had built at impossible scale passed from the world, leaving behind stones too heavy for the civilizations that followed to move. Joints too precise for the tools that followed to replicate, and a buried hilltop in Anatolia whose full contents have not yet been read. But something always passes through. Even the sixth reset could not take everything. The one that disabled the energy systems of the most powerful civilization yet to exist on Earth was technologically devastating. What came through the magnetic collapse and into the world on the other side was smaller, quieter, and more human scaled. And it carried seeds. Literal seeds, the compressed genetic archive of 12,000 years of agricultural development. And it carried the knowledge of how to plant them, tend them, and build a new world from what they produced. That world was ours. And its beginning was not the humble, tentative scratch of a primitive species learning to feed itself. It was the deliberate act of survivors who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Because someone, before the sky went dark, had made sure they would. Chapter 7: The Long Winter and the Survivors. Nothing about the world that emerged from the Younger Dryas resembled the world that had gone into it. This is not a poetic observation. It is a geological one, a biological one, a climatological one, a statement that can be verified in the ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, in the pollen records preserved in lake sediments across the northern hemisphere, in the stratigraphic layers of soil that mark the boundary between one world and the next, with a precision that dates it to within a human lifetime. The Younger Dryas began at approximately 10,900 BCE, when the average temperature in Greenland dropped by 10 degrees Celsius within decades. Not within centuries, not within millennia, but within the span of time that a single person might live through. And it lasted for approximately 1,200 years before ending with an equally abrupt reversal. The temperature rose again by 10 degrees within another decade. The ice retreated, the sky cleared. The world that had been locked under frost and darkness beginning its slow emergence into the current interglacial period. 1,200 years is a long time to survive. It is long enough for everything that was not deliberately preserved to be lost. Not just the physical infrastructure of a civilization which collapses within decades of abandonment, but the institutional memory, the oral tradition, the lineages of initiated knowledge keepers who carry what the buildings cannot. A civilization reduced to survival mode does not maintain universities. It does not hold initiations. It does not send its young people through the years of training that knowledge transmission requires. It feeds them. It keeps them warm. And in doing so, it loses, generation by generation, the knowledge that distinguished it from the animals. It was now competing with for resources in a world that had become hostile to everything it had built. What survived the younger Dryas survived because someone had made a decision before the winter came to preserve it in a form that did not require institutional continuity to maintain. The stone of the Giza Plateau survived because stone does not need an institution to keep it standing. The buried enclosures of Göbekli Tepe survived because clean rubble does not deteriorate. The mathematical ratios encoded in sacred geometry survived because ratios are not physical objects. They exist in the relationships between things. The relationships persist even when the things themselves are damaged, scattered, or reduced to fragments. And the stories survived because stories are the one archive that requires nothing but a human voice and a human listener. And both of those were still available, even in the worst years of the younger Dryas winter. Huddled around fires that were smaller than the fires their grandparents had known, in a world that had contracted to the radius of what a small group of people could defend and feed. The flood traditions that span every human culture on Earth are the most widely distributed single memory in the history of human storytelling. They appear in the Sumerian tradition, in the Hebrew tradition, in the Hindu tradition, in the Greek tradition, in the Mayan tradition, in the Aztec tradition, in the Norse tradition, in the traditions of the Aboriginal Australians, the Maori of New Zealand, the Hopi of the American Southwest, the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region, the Yoruba of West Africa, and more than 200 other cultures whose oral and written traditions have been cataloged by researchers studying flood mythology. The number is not approximate. Folklorist and anthropologist James Fraser cataloged more than 200 independent flood traditions from cultures across every inhabited continent. They share, beneath their cultural differences, the same essential structure: a world before, a catastrophic inundation, a small group of survivors chosen or warned in advance, a period of floating or refuge on high ground, a return to a changed world, and the task of rebuilding from almost nothing. This is not a mythological coincidence. 200 independent cultures do not independently invent the same story with the same structure and the same emotional core. Not unless the story corresponds to something that actually happened. Something so total, so global, and so traumatic that its memory persisted across every line of cultural descent that survived it, regardless of how many generations of retelling reshaped the surface details. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest written narrative in human history, preserved on clay tablets in the Akkadian language and dating in its written form to approximately 2100 BCE. But the oral tradition it records is considerably older, reaching back through Sumerian antecedents to a period before writing existed. Its flood account, contained in the 11th tablet, describes a man named Utnapishtim, who was warned of the coming flood by the god Ea. the god of wisdom and fresh water, the one deity in the Sumerian pantheon whose concern was consistently with the preservation of human life and human knowledge. Ea did not speak to Utamishtim directly. The gods had sworn an oath not to warn humanity of what was coming, and Ea honored the oath in form while violating it in spirit. He spoke to a reed wall in a whisper, knowing that Utnapishtim was sleeping on the other side of it and would hear. The specificity of this detail, the reed wall, the whisper, the technical compliance, is the kind of detail that survives because it was real. It has the texture of an actual memory rather than a mythological invention. Because mythological invention tends toward the grand and the direct, a god appears, speaks clearly, gives unambiguous instructions. What Ea did was more human than divine in its approach, a workaround, a technicality, a way of doing the necessary thing without formally breaking the prohibition against doing it. The instruction Utnapishtim received through the reed wall was precise. Tear down the house, build a boat, take aboard the seed of all living things. The boat's dimensions are given in the text. The duration of the flood is given. The sequence of birds sent out to find land, a dove, a swallow, a raven, is given. The mountain on which the boat came to rest is named as Mount Nemush. The Sanskrit Matsya Purana tells the same story with different names and different cultural specifics. Manu, the first man, the progenitor of humanity in the Vedic tradition, was washing his hands one morning in a river. A small fish appeared in his cupped palms and spoke to him. It asked to be protected. Manu placed it in a jar. It grew until the jar could not contain it. He moved it to a larger vessel, then to a pond, then to a river, then finally to the ocean. It told him its true nature, the god Vishnu in his fish avatar, Matsya, and warned him that a great flood was coming, instructing him to build a boat and take aboard the 7 great sages, the seeds of every plant, and one of every animal. The fish towed the boat through the flood to a northern mountain where it came to rest. From that mountain, Manu descended and repopulated the world. The Aztec tradition names the survivors as Nini and Tata, a man and a woman warned by the water god Tlaloc. He instructed them to hollow out a great cypress log and seal themselves inside it with a single ear of corn each. The flood came. The log floated. When the waters receded, Nini and Tata emerged and caught a fish, which they cooked. They released smoke that rose to the heavens and offended the gods who had not authorized their survival. The specificity of the fish, the smoke, the cypress log, these are not the details of an allegory. They are the details of a story that someone was trying very hard to remember accurately. What these traditions collectively preserve is not just the memory of the flood itself, but the memory of the instruction. The warning given before the waters came, the specific list of what to take, the knowledge that survival was not accidental but prepared. Every major flood tradition includes a version of the advance warning. Every major flood tradition includes a specific curriculum of what the survivors were told to bring. The consistency of this element across 200 independent accounts is the most significant feature. It implies that the survivors understood themselves not merely as people who had been lucky. They were people who had been chosen to carry something specific through the catastrophe and deliver it intact. The younger Dryas's end, when it came quickly. The ice cores from Greenland show the transition as a sharp boundary rather than a gradual slope, a decade of rapid warming that ended 12 centuries of winter in what amounts, geologically, to a single breath. The ice sheets that had advanced across northern Europe and North America began their retreat. The glacial lakes that had accumulated behind ice dams, Lake Agassiz in North America, the largest, found their outlets. They drained in pulses that raised sea levels by meters within decades. The coastlines of the world shifted. The land bridges that had connected Britain to continental Europe, Asia to North America, Sri Lanka to India, these disappeared. The geography of the world that the survivors emerged into was measurably different from the geography of the world their grandparents had known. And the difference was still actively changing around them as they tried to establish the first settlements. The genetic record of this period shows the bottleneck clearly. Modern genetic analysis finds a sharp contraction in the human population corresponding to the Younger Dryas period. A reduction severe enough that the surviving human population may have numbered in the tens of thousands globally at its lowest point. The diversity of the modern human genome narrows measurably at the Younger Dryas boundary and then expands again. The survivors were not a cross-section of the pre-Younger Dryas world's population. They were a selected group, selected by geography, by preparation, or by the deliberate choices of whoever had issued the warnings. Those survivors were not starting from nothing. The traditions are unanimous on this point. The people who came through the flood arrived in the new world carrying something: seeds, teachings, the memory of a mathematical system, the name and function of a god who represented the principle of knowledge preservation, the instructions for a ceremony that would maintain a specific body of information across generations without writing. The survivors were not primitive people learning civilization for the first time. They were the inheritors of 6 civilizational cycles, carrying everything that had not been lost to the ice. And they were waiting for the world to become habitable again, so they could begin the work of unpacking what they had been given. That unpacking began in approximately 9600 BCE, when the temperature rose, the ice retreated, and the sky cleared. A group of people who were not farmers, who had no agriculture, no permanent settlements, began to build. They began to build the largest and most sophisticated monumental complex the world had yet produced. They were not beginning, they were continuing. And what they built at Göbekli Tepe in the first decades after the Younger Dryas ended was not a monument to their own achievement. It was a response to a tradition they had inherited. A tradition that told them exactly what the first obligation of a surviving civilization was in the first years after a reset. The first obligation was to remember, and the second was to build something that would help the next survivors do the same. Chapter 8: The First Farmers and the Seventh Beginning. 9600 BCE is not a round number in the way that historical round numbers usually are, not a convenient approximation, not a date chosen for its symbolic weight. It is the date the ice cores give for the Younger Dryas termination. It is the date the pollen records give for the return of temperate vegetation to the landscapes of the northern hemisphere. The date the sediment cores from the North Atlantic give for the resumption of the thermohaline circulation. This keeps the northern hemisphere's climate livable. It is also, within the margin of the carbon dating methods available, the date of the oldest layer of Göbekli Tepe. The correspondence is close enough that researchers who accept both dates have noted it with varying degrees of discomfort, because the implication is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were watching for the end of the Younger Dryas. They began building the moment it arrived. It was as if they had been waiting for a specific signal before beginning a project they had already planned in full. The signal was not agricultural surplus. This cannot be overstated because the standard model of civilizational development rests on a specific assumption. The assumption is that monumental construction follows food security, that a population must first solve the problem of feeding itself reliably before it can organize large building projects. Göbekli Tepe inverts this entirely. Its builders were hunter-gatherers. The bones found in the fill around the site, the accumulated refuse of the people who worked there, are the bones of wild animals: gazelle, aurochs, red deer, wild boar. There is no evidence of domesticated grain, no evidence of permanent settlement, no evidence of agricultural infrastructure. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not farmers who had accumulated enough surplus to build a temple. They were something else, people with a different kind of organizational principle, a different motivation. They had a different understanding of what the first priority of their historical moment was. The site itself covers an area of at least 90,000 square meters on the highest point of a limestone ridge. This sits in the Jurmas range of the Taurus Mountains. What Klaus Schmidt excavated from 1994 until his death in 2014 represents perhaps 5% of what the geophysical surveys suggest is buried across that area. Layer 3, the oldest layer, the one that contains the large T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, has been dated to between 9600 and 8200 BCE. Layer 2, above it, contains smaller pillars in rectangular enclosures and dates to between 8200 and 7500 BCE. The progression from layer 3 to layer 2 is not a progression of increasing sophistication. It runs the other way. The oldest layer is the most accomplished, the most precisely executed, the most astronomically informed. The later layers are simpler. This is the opposite of what the standard developmental model predicts. It is consistent with what the hidden timeline predicts: a civilization beginning in the immediate aftermath of a reset with the compressed knowledge of the previous cycle. Knowledge then gradually losing resolution as it dilutes across generations that have less and less direct access to its original sources. The astronomical alignments of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures have been analyzed by researchers including Giulio Maggi and Juan Antonio Belmonte. They published findings in 2016 suggesting that the enclosures were oriented toward the star Deneb. They were also oriented toward the rising point of a specific stellar configuration as it appeared in the sky of approximately 10,000 BCE. The central pillars of the enclosures, the two largest T-shaped stones in each circle, are oriented with a precision that casual construction does not achieve. Someone measured the sky carefully and then cut and positioned stones weighing between 10 and 20 tons. They did this to reflect those measurements with the exactness of an instrument rather than the approximation of an approximation. The carvings on the pillars have attracted as much attention as the alignments. The surfaces of the central pillars in enclosure D carry bas relief images of animals: foxes, cranes, bulls, scorpions, vultures, ducks, arranged in configurations that researchers have begun to read as astronomical maps. The animals correspond to star groupings in the sky of the site's construction period. A carved belt and hands appear on the lower portions of the central pillars. This marks them as representations of beings rather than abstract monuments, as if the pillars are portraits, standing figures in stone, facing each other across the enclosure in the posture of entities holding a space open. One pillar in enclosure D carries what some researchers have identified as a depiction of a comet fragmentation event, a series of objects falling toward a horizon, accompanied by imagery of fire and disruption. It was positioned on the stone in a way that suggests it is not decorative, but documentary, a record of what had happened, cut into the archive to ensure that whoever opened the archive later would find the warning they needed. Göbekli Tepe was buried deliberately around 8000 BCE. The fill that covers it is clean. It is not the stratified accumulation of habitation refuse that marks a site that was lived in and then abandoned, but specifically sourced rubble, carried to the site and packed into the enclosures with care. The burial was not a collapse. It was a closure, the act of a community that had completed what it came to do. They were now sealing the work against whatever came next. The deliberateness of the burial is matched by the deliberateness of the construction. Both reflect a people who understood themselves as operating within a longer timeline than their own lives. They saw their role not as building for themselves, but as building for a future they would not inhabit. While Göbekli Tepe was being built and then buried in the highlands of Anatolia, something was happening in the lowlands to the south, something that would change the entire trajectory of the seventh civilization's development. The Natufian culture had inhabited the Levantine corridor for at least 3,000 years before the Younger Dryas ended. They had been gathering wild grains since approximately 12,500 BCE. They had developed the tools for it: the sickle blades, the grinding stones, the storage pits lined with plaster. During the Younger Dryas, they had contracted, their settlements smaller, their territory reduced. Their reliance on gathered plant foods was diminished by the cold and dry conditions that made plant growth sparse. But they had kept the knowledge. The sickle blades were still being knapped. The grinding stones were still being used. The understanding of which plants, in which soils, in which seasons, produced the most reliable yields. This had been maintained across 12 centuries of winter. It was maintained in the bodies and practices of a people who understood that the seeds they were tending were not just food. They were the genetic archive of the agricultural world that would follow. When the Younger Dryas ended and the rains returned to the Levant, the Natufians did not discover agriculture. They deployed it. Within centuries of the climate stabilization, the wild einkorn wheat of the Karakadag Mountains in southeastern Turkey had been domesticated. This is the closest wild ancestor of all modern domesticated wheat, growing in a range that overlaps with the region of Göbekli Tepe. Emmer wheat followed, then barley, lentils, bitter vetch, chickpeas, and flax, the 8 founder crops of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. All were domesticated within a relatively concentrated geographic zone in the millennium following the Younger Dryas termination. The speed of this domestication, measured in centuries rather than the millennia that random trial and error would require, has struck historians as anomalous. Domestication is a complex process requiring the selection of specific genetic variants. It requires the development of cultivation techniques suited to those variants, and the institutional persistence to maintain selection pressure across enough generations for the desired traits to stabilize. It does not happen fast by accident. It happens fast when someone already knows what they are looking for. Catalhoyuk rose in the Konya plain of central Anatolia sometime around 7500 BCE. It endured as a settled community until approximately 5700 BCE, nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation. At its height, it housed somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people in a settlement unlike anything that followed. There were no streets. The houses of Catalhoyuk were built wall to wall, sharing exterior surfaces with their neighbors. They formed a continuous mass of mud brick construction with no alleys, no pathways, no public spaces at ground level. Entry to each house was through a hole in the roof, accessed by a wooden ladder. The interior of each house was divided between a living area and a working area, and beneath the sleeping platforms of the living area, beneath the specific place where the inhabitants lay down each night, the dead were buried. The bones of the house's previous residents lay directly beneath the bodies of its current ones across generations. This formed a continuity between the living and the dead that was structural and physical rather than merely ceremonial. The walls of Catalhoyuk's houses were plastered and painted. The paintings that have survived are executed with a confidence and a compositional intelligence. Bulls, hunting scenes, geometric patterns, handprints, they do not look like the beginning of a pictorial tradition. They look like the middle of one. The bull imagery in particular, the aurochs rendered on the plaster walls in poses that emphasize its power, appears at Catalhoyuk in a familiar form. It will later show up in the bull cults of Minoan Crete, in the Apis bull tradition of Egypt, and in the Nandi bull of Vedic India. The same image, the same animal, the same ceremonial weight, distributed across cultures that have no direct contact with Catalhoyuk. It appears as if from a common source that precedes all of them. Jericho had a stone tower before 8000 BCE. The tower stands nearly 9 meters tall, a cylinder of undressed stone with an interior staircase of 22 steps. It was built into the defensive wall of a settlement that carbon dates to approximately 8000 BCE. The people who built it were not in an early stage of learning to work with stone. The tower is competently engineered. Its walls are thick enough to support its height. its staircase functional and precisely cut, its foundations deep enough to anchor a structure meant to last. It lasted 10,000 years before anyone found it. The civilization that built it left no written record of its name, its beliefs, or its understanding of the world. But it left a tower, 9 meters tall, in the oldest continuously inhabited city on Earth, a tower that predates the Egyptian pyramids by 5,000 years. It still stands as evidence that the people of the early 7th civilization were not learning to build. They were remembering how. The seventh beginning was not a beginning in the sense of a first attempt. It was a resumption, a civilization picking up a thread that had been set down during the worst years of the Younger Dryas winter. They returned to it with the patience of people who understood that the thread was still there, that it had not broken, that what had been known before the cold came could be known again if the conditions for knowing it were carefully rebuilt. The agricultural revolution was not an invention, it was a recovery. The monumental architecture of Göbekli Tepe was not a primitive culture's first experiment with organized labor. It was a sophisticated civilization's deliberate first act after a reset. The act of archiving before building, of ensuring the knowledge was secured before the project of rebuilding began. What the seventh civilization built in its first 2,000 years was the foundation on which everything that followed would rest. From the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the painted walls of Catalhoyuk to the Tower of Jericho to the wild grain fields of the Karakateg becoming the wheat fields of the Fertile Crescent. The pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the stone circles of Britain, the temple complexes of the Indus Valley. These were not the achievements of a civilization that had figured out, for the first time, how to organize human effort at scale. They were the visible portion of a recovery project that had been underway since the first morning after the Younger Dryas ended. When someone climbed a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, looked out at a world that was slowly warming, and began to build. But the seventh civilization did not develop in isolation from the deeper past. Running alongside its own emerging history were older lines, not civilizations in the sense of the six that preceded ours, but lineages of beings whose existence in the archaeological record is impossible to explain within the standard narrative, whose relationship to the human civilizational project may be more direct and more intimate than any textbook has yet acknowledged. Those older lines left traces in our bones, and the traces raise questions about who exactly taught the earliest humans what they knew. Questions that the Sumerian king list has been patiently posing for 4,000 years, waiting for a civilization sophisticated enough to take them seriously. Chapter 9: The Older Lines, Denisovans, the King List, and the Teachers. The story of human civilization, as the hidden timeline tells it, is not only the story of 7 successive civilizations rising and falling in sequence. Running alongside that sequence are older lines, sometimes parallel to it, sometimes intersecting with it, sometimes preceding it by margins of time so vast that the civilizational cycles themselves look recent by comparison. Other kinds of mind, in other kinds of body. Working with the physical world in ways that left traces the modern genome has only recently learned to read. The archaeological record has been quietly producing these traces for decades. This occurred without the interpretive framework necessary to understand what it was finding. The Denisova cave sits in the Altai Mountains of Siberia at an altitude of 700 meters above sea level. It rests in a limestone ridge overlooking the Anu River. It has been inhabited, the sediment record shows, for at least 280,000 years. It was held by Neanderthals and by the species that would come to be called Denisovans. At various points, it was held by both simultaneously in a pattern of shared occupation. The cave's stratigraphy records this with the patience of deep time. In 2008, a Russian archaeologist named Mikhail Shumkov brought a fragment of finger bone from the cave's eastern gallery to Leipzig. There, a team led by Svante Pääbo sequenced its mitochondrial DNA. They found something that did not match any known hominin species. The finger bone belonged to a girl, estimated to have been between 5 and 7 years old at the time of her death. She had lived in the Altai approximately 50,000 years ago. She was not a modern human. She was not a Neanderthal. She was something else, a third kind of human, previously unknown to science. She is now named for the cave in which her fragment of bone had rested for 50 millennia. The Denisovans, as the genetic analysis has continued to develop them, were not a minor regional variant. They were a population of enormous geographic range. Their DNA has been found in the genomes of modern populations from Siberia to Southeast Asia to the islands of Melanesia. This suggests they occupied a territory spanning most of the eastern Eurasian continent. They held the island chains of the western Pacific for hundreds of thousands of years. The Melanesian populations carry Denisovan DNA at levels of 4 to 6% of their total genome. This contribution is large enough to indicate not occasional interbreeding but sustained, repeated contact. This contact lasted across many generations. The people of Tibet carry a specific Denisovan gene variant, EPAS1. This allows their bodies to function at high altitude without the chronic mountain sickness that afflicts lowland populations. It was a genetic gift from a people who had spent enough time in the high places of the world. They had evolved a solution to the oxygen problem that those places pose. What the Denisovans built, what they knew, what their civilization consisted of, is almost entirely unknown. The physical remains recovered from the cave amount to a finger bone fragment, 3 teeth, and bone fragments. From these fragments, genetic analysis has reconstructed a population. But fragments of bone do not reconstruct a way of life. One artifact, however, has been recovered from the Denisova cave deposits that does not fit the available framework. It is a bracelet. The bracelet was found in layer 11 of the cave's eastern gallery. It sits in a stratum that dates to between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago. It is made of chlorite, a green metamorphic stone not found in the immediate vicinity of the cave. This means it was sourced from elsewhere and transported to the site. Its outer surface has been polished to a smoothness and a luster that modern experimental archaeologists have been unable to achieve. They attempted to replicate it using the stone tools of the period. The polish requires a rotary tool, a device that spins an abrasive surface against the stone at sustained speed. It works the way a modern lapidary wheel works. Rotary tools, in the mainstream archaeological timeline, do not exist for another 40 to 45,000 years. This is a massive gap in the established record. The bracelet also contains a hole drilled through its thickness. The interior surface is smooth and the edges are sharp in the way that modern drill bits produce. It is not the ragged, conical interior of a hand-driven stone drill. It is the clean, cylindrical channel of a bit rotating at consistent speed under consistent pressure. The Denisovan bracelet is either the most anomalous artifact in the archaeological record, or it is evidence of a forgotten technology. It suggests a technology the standard timeline has no room for. The Toba supervolcano eruption occurred approximately 74,000 years ago. It was located on the island of Sumatra and produced the largest volcanic event of the past 2 million years. The eruption ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere. This was enough to cover the entire surface of India in a layer of ash 5 meters deep. It was enough to drop global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for a decade. It triggered what researchers have called a volcanic winter lasting years. This was followed by a period of glacial advance that fundamentally altered the biosphere of the planet. The human population numbered perhaps several 100,000 individuals. The population contracted in the aftermath to a bottleneck so severe that only a few thousand remained. Genetic analysis places the surviving breeding population at 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. Every human being alive today is descended from that small group. We are a founding population smaller than the current population of a modest town. We carry the genetic diversity of a species that had very nearly ceased to exist. The Denisovans survived Toba. The Neanderthals survived Toba. Other hominin populations survived whose physical remains have not yet been found. Researchers call them ghost populations, detectable only as statistical anomalies in the modern genome. These were contributions to the human DNA sequence that cannot be accounted for by the known hominins. These ghost populations also survived the Toba catastrophe. These were not primitive creatures sheltering in caves from the cold. They were populations with hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. They understood the landscapes they inhabited, the plants, and the animals. They understood the seasonal patterns that govern survival in specific environments. In the Denisovan case, they possessed a material technology sophisticated enough to produce polished chlorite. They produced a precision-drilled hole 50,000 years before the timeline permits. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest documents in human possession. It is preserved on a clay prism now held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It was composed sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE. It drew on older oral and written sources, and it lists the kings of Sumer in order. It begins with the antediluvian kings who ruled before the flood. It continues through the dynasties of the post-flood period into historical times. The post-flood kings are recognizable. Their reigns are measured in decades, their cities are archaeologically attested, and their names appear in other documents. The antediluvian kings are something else entirely. 8 kings ruled before the flood, according to the list, in 5 ancient cities. The first king was Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. The second was Alangar, also of Eridu, who ruled for 36,000 years. The remaining 6 antediluvian kings ruled for periods ranging from 18,600 years to 43,200 years each. The total combined reign of the 8 kings is 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over the land, the list records. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, and the post-flood kings began ruling in decades. The standard interpretation is that these numbers are mythological. It assumes the Sumerians used large numbers to convey the antiquity and importance of the period. This interpretation is almost certainly partially correct and almost certainly partially insufficient. The numbers are not random. 241,200 is divisible by 60, the base of the Sumerian mathematical system. It is also divisible by the precessional cycle of 25,920 years. The individual reign lengths, when analyzed, resolve to multiples of specific astronomical periods. They match the synodic period of Saturn and the orbital period of Jupiter. The Sumerians were encoding something in these numbers. The question is not whether the antediluvian kings literally ruled for tens of thousands of years. The question is what the Sumerians were trying to say when they assigned those numbers to those kings. It was a system that demonstrably encoded astronomical data in numerical form. What they may have been trying to say is that these kings belong to a different order of time. They were not humans in the post-flood sense, with human lifespans. They were beings of a different kind, operating on a different timescale. They lived in a world that ran at a different pace than the world the Sumerians inhabited. The Vedic tradition makes the same move when it assigns the ancient rishis lifespans of thousands of years. These were sages who received and preserved the Vedic hymns. They possessed capacities of knowledge and perception that exceed anything available to the human beings who came after them. Their world was fundamentally different. The Mahabharata's heroes live in a world where the rules of biology did not yet fully apply. The book of Genesis assigns Adam a lifespan of 930 years. Methuselah is assigned 969 years. The numbers diminish across the generations, from the pre-flood patriarchs to the post-flood ones. This trajectory reads less like mythology and more like a record of something changing. It suggests a biological or environmental condition that sustained extraordinary longevity. This condition gradually gave way to the conditions that now prevail in our world. The teachers who appear at the beginning of every civilizational tradition are not independent mythological inventions. They appear in the Sumerian Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged from the sea. They taught humanity the arts of civilization before the flood. They appear as the Vedic rishis who received the original hymns from a superhuman source. They are the Egyptian Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. They ruled Egypt before the historical pharaonic dynasties began. They are the Mesoamerican Viracochas, the white-bearded beings who arrived from the sea. They taught agriculture, architecture, and law before departing. These are independent cultural memories of the same phenomenon. They describe beings of non-ordinary capacities, appearing at the beginning of each civilizational cycle. They arrive after a reset, transmitting the compressed knowledge of previous cycles. They give this knowledge to the human populations beginning the rebuilding. Whether those beings were Denisovans or Neanderthal hybrids, the traditions do not agree. They may have been the remnant priestly class of the fifth civilization. They may have maintained the traditions of Thoth Herms in a form that allowed them to be present at the start of the seventh. The traditions agree on their function. They came. They taught. They left, or they withdrew. They were absorbed into the populations they had educated. The knowledge they carried was passed from the superhuman to the human. Every culture on Earth has preserved the memory of this transmission. It is preserved in the form most natural to that culture's way of remembering. The Denisovan bracelet sits in a museum in Novosibirsk. The Sumerian king list sits in the Ashmolean. The Book of Enoch sits in the libraries of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It is read as scripture by 80 million people who believe it is a literal account. They believe it tells what happened in the world before the flood. These are not separate artifacts pointing in separate directions. They are different windows into the same room. That room contains an older and more complex human story than the one that begins in Mesopotamia. This story does not proceed in a straight line to the present, but the oldest physical evidence for a predecessor civilization does not lie in a museum. It lies under ice, under nearly 2 kilometers of ice. It is in a continent that was not officially discovered until 1820. It is on a coastline that appears on a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. He said he had copied it from sources considerably older than himself. That map and what it shows, and why it should not exist, that is where this chronicle turns next. Chapter 10: The Frozen Map and the Buried Continent. In 1929, a Turkish national named Halil Edhem was sorting through a collection of old documents in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. The palace was the former administrative heart of the Ottoman Empire, a complex of courtyards and pavilions overlooking the Bosphorus. Over 5 centuries of imperial record-keeping, the archive had accumulated a massive collection of maps, charts, and correspondence. These administrative documents represented a history whose full contents had never been catalogued. Edhem was the director of the National Museums of Turkey, and the sorting project was not glamorous work. He spent his days in the careful examination of fragmented parchments and faded manuscripts in a storage room of a palace that had seen better days. Most of what he found was exactly what he expected to find. He uncovered the routine cartographic and administrative documentation of an empire that had once spanned 3 continents. What he found that day was not routine. The fragment of parchment he pulled from the collection was a portion of a larger map, drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. His full name was Haji Muhyiddin Piri ibn Haji Mehmed, a man who had spent his life mapping the coastlines of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. He worked with the methodical precision of a naval officer for whom accurate charts were a matter of professional survival. The fragment showed the coastlines of Western Europe, Western Africa, and the Americas. These portions of the map were consistent with what a skilled cartographer working in 1513 might reasonably have produced. He drew on the accounts of Columbus and the Iberian explorers of the preceding decades. These portions were unremarkable, if impressive. What was truly remarkable was the southern portion of the map, a landmass extending along the bottom of the parchment below the southernmost tip of South America. This landmass was in the exact position where Antarctica would be if Antarctica appeared on a map of 1513. Antarctica was not discovered until 1820. The first confirmed sightings are attributed to three expeditions operating independently in that year: the Russian expedition of Bellingshausen, the British expedition of Bransfield, and the American voyage of Nathaniel Palmer. Before 1820, the existence of a southern continent was a matter of geographical theory. It was hypothesized by ancient Greek geographers on the grounds that the known northern landmasses required a southern counterweight to keep the world in balance. But this theory was never confirmed by direct observation. No European cartographer of 1513 had seen the Antarctic coastline, and no European ship had reached it. The knowledge required to draw it accurately did not exist in 1513. And yet the southern landmass on the Piri-Reis map is not a theoretical continent. It is not the smooth schematic outline of a hypothetical geographical balance. It is a detailed coastline with bays and peninsulas and inlets rendered with the specificity of a chart based on direct observation. It suggests the recording of physical reality rather than theoretical inference. More specifically, it is a coastline that matches the coastline of Antarctica as it exists beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. This has been confirmed by cartographic researchers using modern satellite imaging data. It depicts the coastline of the continent as it would appear if the ice that has covered it for the past 12,000 years were removed. Piri-Reis addressed this directly in the marginalia of his own map. He wrote in his own hand that the map had been compiled from a collection of older source maps. Some of these documents dated from the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander had made a practice of collecting geographic documents from the territories he conquered. Piri-Reis noted that some of the source materials were of uncertain origin and great age. They were older than the classical period, drawn by people whose identity he could not determine. He was not claiming original survey work for the southern coastline. He was claiming that he had copied it from something older, something that already existed when his sources compiled it. It had been passed forward through the cartographic tradition without anyone fully understanding where it had originally come from. Charles Hapgood was a professor of the history of science at Keene State College in New Hampshire. He was not a geologist or a cartographer by training, but a methodical researcher with the discipline to follow an anomaly wherever it led. He spent years studying the Piri-Reis map and a collection of other early modern maps that showed similar anomalies. These included the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which showed Antarctica with interior mountain ranges. He also studied the Mercator map of 1538 and the Bucca map of 1737. The Buache map showed Antarctica divided into two landmasses by a subglacial sea. This specific feature was confirmed by seismic survey only in the 20th century. Hapgood published his conclusion in his 1958 book, Earth's Shifting Crust. He believed these maps were copies of copies of copies. They represented a cartographic tradition reaching back to a period before the Antarctic ice cap had advanced to its current extent. This was a time when the continent's coastline was accessible to direct observation and direct survey. Albert Einstein wrote the foreword to Earth's shifting crust. This is not a minor detail. Einstein was the most recognized scientific authority in the world, and he did not write forewords casually. His foreword described Hapgood's hypothesis as deserving serious consideration. He believed it presented evidence that the standard geological framework had not adequately addressed. Einstein died in April of 1955, 3 years before the book's publication. The foreword was written in the final years of his life when he had nothing to protect professionally. He found the hypothesis genuinely compelling. Hapgood's crustal displacement theory proposed that the outer shell of the Earth could slip as a unit relative to the inner layers. This shell floats on the semi-fluid asthenosphere beneath. Under sufficient gravitational stress from the accumulation of asymmetric ice loads, the geographic positions of the poles could move by significant distances. This would happen within geologically brief periods. Under this model, Antarctica would not always have been at the South Pole. It would have occupied a more temperate position further north. This climate would have been capable of supporting vegetation, liquid water, and biological systems. It could support the requirements of a living civilization. Then, a crustal displacement event moved it to its current polar position. The ice cap that now covers it accumulated over the millennia following the displacement. The displacement would have been catastrophic for everything living on the surface. It would have triggered massive seismic and volcanic activity as the crust moved relative to the mantle. Tsunamis would be generated by the sudden displacement of ocean basins. There would be massive atmospheric disruption caused by the rapid repositioning of the world's largest ice sheet. These events would have constituted a reset mechanism of the most thorough kind. They would have left exactly the kind of boundary layer that the Younger Dryas transition represents. The continent beneath the Antarctic ice is not a flat basin. This has been established by the BD Map 2 survey, a comprehensive compilation of ice-penetrating radar measurements and seismic data. Published by the British Antarctic Survey in 2013, it produced the most detailed map yet made of the subglacial topography. What BD Map 2 shows is a continent of considerable geographic complexity. It revealed mountain ranges, including the Gamburtsev Mountains in East Antarctica. These rise to over 3,400 meters above sea level beneath 4 kilometers of ice. It showed river valleys carved by liquid water erosion. This indicates a period when liquid water flowed across the surface of the continent. There are lake systems, including the subglacial Lake Vostok. It is the 6th largest lake in the world by volume, sealed beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. It sits in a basin whose shape is consistent with a surface lake formed under temperate conditions. Graham Hancock spent years traveling to the anomalous sites of the ancient world. He visited Tiwanaku, Giza, Angkor Wat, and the megalithic sites of Malta. He published his synthesis in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. He argued that the consistent mathematical encoding found across these sites pointed toward a single conclusion. A civilization of considerable sophistication had existed before the Younger Dryas. It was destroyed by catastrophic flooding and left traces in the stone and sacred texts of every culture that succeeded it. Fingerprints of the Gods was dismissed by mainstream archaeology on publication. Yet it has sold millions of copies in the decades since. This suggests that the mainstream dismissal and the public's intuition are operating from different premises. They are arriving at different conclusions. The Ross Ice Shelf covers an area roughly the size of France. This is approximately 487,000 square kilometers of floating ice extending into the Ross Sea. Beneath it lies the coastline that appears on the Piri Reis map. The series of bays, capes, and inlets match the map's southern landmass with a correspondence too detailed to be coincidental. Whatever civilization surveyed that coastline did so when it was accessible. The ice that now buries it had not yet accumulated. The Ross Sea was open water, and the Antarctic coast was a navigable shoreline. It was a climate that permitted the kind of sustained observation that accurate cartography requires. Modern satellite imaging has produced findings that researchers in the anomalous archaeology community have noted with interest. They have identified structures in the subglacial topography. These features show the right-angle geometry and consistent dimensions of constructed objects. They do not look like the irregular forms of natural geological features. These identifications are contested. The mainstream geological interpretation is that the features are nunataks, isolated peaks of bedrock projecting through the ice. The alternative interpretation is that they are the buried remains of construction. They could be buildings or the foundations of a civilization that occupied Antarctica before the ice came. The question of what is under the Antarctic ice is not a minor archaeological curiosity. It is potentially the most significant unanswered question in the history of human civilization. If the sixth civilization's heartland was in Antarctica, then its primary archive is currently under nearly 2 kilometers of ice. Its hall of records is in the most logistically inaccessible location on Earth. The tools required to reach it already exist or could be developed. We have deep ice drilling technology capable of penetrating kilometers of ice without contamination. However, the political will to permit such an excavation does not yet exist. It would require the cooperation of the Antarctic Treaty Nations. The premise that there is something down there worth looking for has not been accepted by major institutions. They control the relevant resources and the narrative. But the map exists. It has been in the Topkapi Palace since at least the 16th century. It was drawn by a careful man who said he copied it from older sources. It shows a coastline that no one in his time had seen, in a position that places it exactly where Antarctica is. The map does not argue for itself. It simply shows what it shows with the patience of a document that has been waiting since 1513. It waits for the civilization that found it to develop the framework necessary to understand what it means. That framework requires more than cartography and geology. It requires the kind of deep time perspective that only becomes available when a civilization looks honestly at the mythological record. We must look at the traditions that every culture on Earth has maintained about the cycling of ages. They speak of the destruction of worlds and the return of what was lost. The most remarkable thing about the hidden timeline is not that six civilizations preceded ours. It is that so many of those civilizations knew they would be followed. They left instructions in every medium available to them for how to find what they had preserved. Those instructions are encoded not only in stone and in maps, they are encoded in the oldest mathematical traditions on Earth. They exist in the sacred calendars of cultures that measured time in cycles of civilizational duration. These numbers, when examined carefully, point at a specific position in the sequence. It is a position that happens to coincide with a precision that is either extraordinary or inevitable. It coincides with the moment in which we are currently living. Chapter 11: The Mythology of Return. How Every Tradition Remembered. Numbers do not survive by accident. A story can mutate across generations of retelling. Characters change their names. Settings shift from one geography to another. The emotional coloring of an event darkens or brightens depending on the cultural moment of the teller. But a number, once embedded in a sacred mathematical tradition and reinforced by astronomical observation, resists mutation with a stubbornness that no other element of transmitted knowledge matches. You cannot accidentally change 25,920 into something else if you have been checking it against the sky every year for 1,000 years and finding it accurate. You cannot round off 4,320,000 into a convenient approximation if the entire calendrical and ceremonial system of your civilization depends on its precision. Numbers embedded in astronomical observation are anchored to something outside human preference, outside cultural drift, outside the ordinary entropy that time applies to everything transmitted through human memory. They are anchored to the sky, which does not change to accommodate a tradition that has gotten them wrong. The number 4,320,000 is the total duration of one complete yuga cycle in the Vedic system, the Mahayuga, the Great Age, the full rotation of the civilizational wheel from the Satya Yuga through the Treta, the Dvapara, and the Kali, back to the beginning of the next Satya. It is not a round number in the sense of an approximation. It is 4,320,000 precisely, and it is divisible by every significant astronomical period in the Vedic mathematical system. By 25,920, the precessional cycle, yielding 166.67. By 432, the base unit of the system, yielding 10,000. By 60, the Babylonian mathematical base, yielding 72,000. The number 432 appears independently in the Babylonian king list. The combined reign of the antediluvian kings in the Berosus tradition is 432,000 years. It appears in the Norse tradition. At Ragnarok, 800 warriors emerge from each of the 540 doors of Valhalla, and 800 multiplied by 540 is 432,000. It appears in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, the pyramid's base perimeter, in the pyramid inches that the original survey measurements produce, is 36,524.2, meest, 10 times the number of days in a solar year. The same numbers, encoded in the same relationships, distributed across traditions that had no documented contact, anchored to the same astronomical realities. The Vedic tradition divides the Mahayuga into four unequal parts in a ratio of 4:3:2:1. The Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, the age of the first and second civilizations, lasts 1,728,000 years. The Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, lasts 1,296,000 years. The Dvapara Yuga, the Bronze Age, lasts 864,000 years. The Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the age of darkness and forgetting, the age we currently inhabit, lasts 432,000 years. The traditional calculation of the Kali Yuga's beginning, accepted by Hindu astronomical tradition and still used in the calculation of the Vedic calendar, places its start at February 18th, 3102 BCE. This is a date that corresponds, in the archaeological record, to the beginning of the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, the consolidation of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, and the earliest layers of the Indus Valley civilization. The most recent civilizational flowering of the Seventh Age, in other words, began precisely at the moment the Vedic calendar says the age of forgetting commenced. The irony is as precise as the number. The Kali Yuga is described in the Vedic texts with a specificity that reads, from the present vantage point, as less like prophetic vision and more like accurate description. The Vishnu Purana's account of the Kali Yuga describes an age in which property alone confers rank, wealth becomes the only virtue, and passion and luxury are the sole bonds between spouses. Falsehood is the only means of success in litigation, and the earth is venerated only for its mineral wealth. Leaders devour their subjects. Children abandon their parents. The sky rains inadequately. The planet's produce deteriorates. The tradition is not describing a future it fears. It is describing a pattern it has seen before. The final phase of a civilizational cycle. The age when the accumulated forgetting of three preceding ages reaches its maximum, when the distance from the original knowledge is greatest. The Kali Yuga is not a punishment. It is a position in a cycle, and like all positions in a cycle, it ends. The Hopi people of the American Southwest have maintained, across generations of oral transmission reinforced by ceremony, a cosmological account of the present world's place in a sequence of creation and destruction. This parallels the Vedic system with a precision that conventional anthropology has explained as coincidence, and the hidden timeline explains as common origin. The Hopi describe four worlds. They call them the first, second, third, and fourth worlds, each presided over by a different set of conditions. Each ended when the beings inhabiting it failed to maintain the proper relationship with the Creator's plan. The first world ended by fire. The second world ended by ice. The poles shifted. The world rolled over. The ice came. The third world ended by water, a great flood sent by the Creator after the people's corruption exceeded the threshold of what could be sustained. The fourth world is the present one. The Hopi do not say it will last forever. Frank Waters spent years with the Hopi elders of the Arizona mesas in the late 1950s and early 1960s, working with a Hopi English interpreter named Oswald Whitebear Fredericks to record what the elders were willing to share. He published the result in 1963 as the Book of the Hopi. The account of the Third World's ending that Waters recorded is specific in a way that casual mythology is not. The Third World's people had developed, the elders described, a technology of flying shields, circular craft that could travel through the air. They were used in the final corruption of the Third World as weapons in wars between nations. The Creator, having warned the people through his messenger Spider Grandmother and found the warnings unheeded, instructed the few who had maintained the proper relationship with the original teachings to seal themselves inside hollow reeds. The flood came. The waters rose over the highest mountains. The reed dwellers floated. When the waters receded, they emerged into the fourth world, a world smaller, simpler, and more demanding than the one they had left. A world in which the proper relationship with the land and with the Creator's plan would have to be rebuilt from the beginning. The flying shields are worth pausing on, not to sensationalize them, but because they appear in other traditions describing the pre-flood world with a consistency that the coincidence explanation strains to cover. The Vedic texts describe the Vimanas, flying craft of various designs, some disc-shaped, some cigar-shaped, some described as cities in the sky. These were used in the wars of the Dvapara Yuga by figures of superhuman capacity, the Mahabharata's aerial battles, rendered in the epic's characteristic combination of mythological grandeur and technical specificity, describe weapons and vehicles whose operating principles are not always distinguishable from the description of technology. The Ramayana's Pushpaka Vimana carries Rama and Sita through the air from Lanka to Ayodhya at a speed that covers the distance in a day. These descriptions have attracted the attention of both the credulous and the dismissive in roughly equal measure. The truth they contain is probably neither the literal aircraft of ancient astronaut theory nor the pure allegory of demythologizing scholarship, but something in between, the kind of compressed memory that a tradition preserves when it is trying to describe a technology it no longer has the vocabulary for. Reaching for the nearest available image and arriving at something that sounds, to a later reader, either miraculous or metaphorical. The Egyptian tradition preserves its account of civilizational cycling in a text known as the Destruction of Mankind, recorded in the tomb of Seti I and in several other New Kingdom royal tombs. It dates in its written form to the 14th century BCE, but carries within it the markers of a much older oral tradition. The text describes a moment when Ra, the sun god, the principle of cosmic order, the sustaining intelligence behind the civilizational project, grew old. His bones became silver, his flesh gold, his hair the blue of lapis lazuli, the colors of an ancient being, precious but diminished, no longer young. And the people, seeing Ra's diminishment, began to plot against him. Ra, informed of the plotting by the god Nun, convened a council of the gods and asked what should be done. The council advised destruction. Ra called his eye, the goddess Hathor, in her aspect as Sekhmet the lioness, and sent her forth to punish humanity. Sekhmet descended on the people with such thoroughness that the gods, watching the destruction, became concerned that she would leave no survivors at all. Ra relented. He ordered the fields of Egypt flooded with red-dyed beer, 7,000 jars of beer mixed with red ochre to resemble blood. It was poured out across the land at night, so that when Sekhmet descended the following morning, she saw what appeared to be a world already drowned in the blood of her destruction. She drank. She became intoxicated. She forgot her mission. The people who remained were spared, and Ra, weary beyond any weariness that had come before, withdrew from the direct administration of the world. He ascended to the sky on the back of a celestial cow, leaving the earth to be governed by his representatives, the first pharaohs, the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. They maintained the connection between the human world and the principles of cosmic order that Ra had embodied directly. The red beer is a detail that does not fit allegory comfortably. Allegory does not usually specify the coloring agent and the quantity. The detail belongs to a different register, the register of historical memory, of an account that has been told with enough fidelity to preserve the specific, idiosyncratic, unrepeatable fact. Something happened that the Egyptians remembered as Re's withdrawal, some transition in the governing structure of the civilization, some moment when direct contact with the knowledge source became indirect, mediated, available only through the initiated priesthood rather than through the living presence of the original teachers. The red beer preserves the moment the way a fly preserves an amber, not interpreted, not explained, not smoothed into comfortable symbolism. It is held in its specific strangeness, waiting for a reader patient enough to ask what it means. The Book of Enoch adds a dimension to the cycling tradition that the other accounts do not provide, an explanation for why each age ends in corruption as well as catastrophe. The Watchers, those 200 beings who descended on Mount Hermon and transmitted the knowledge of civilization to pre-flood humanity, are described in Enoch not only as teachers, but as transgressors. They crossed a boundary that was not theirs to cross. The knowledge they gave was real knowledge: astronomy, metallurgy, the preparation of medicines, the understanding of natural forces. But it was given before humanity was ready to use it wisely, and the result was a civilization of extraordinary capacity and extraordinary corruption. In this world, the tools of knowledge became the instruments of domination, in which the Nephilim who inherited the Watcher's power used it for conquest rather than for stewardship. The flood that ended that civilization was not, in Enoch's account, a simple punishment. It was a reset of the conditions, a reduction of humanity to a scale at which the remaining knowledge could be used sustainably, at which the gap between capacity and wisdom was not so catastrophically wide. This pattern, knowledge given before its time, capacity outrunning wisdom, catastrophe restoring the balance, appears in every major tradition that addresses why civilizational cycles end. It appears in the Vedic account of the Dwapara Yuga's wars. It appears in the Hopi account of the Third World's flying shields turned to weapons. It appears in the Atlantean tradition's account of the crystal technology misused for military dominance. It appears in the Sumerian tradition's account of the antediluvian kings, whose power exceeded the proper boundaries of human governance. The traditions are not describing different events with the same emotional coloring. They are describing the same structural failure. The failure that occurs when any civilization reaches the point in its development where its technological capacity has outpaced the ethical and spiritual development of the people wielding it. And they are encoding that description in the most memorable, most transmissible form available to them. The sacred story, the ceremony, the number embedded in the sky. The number 72 appears in this context with a frequency that researchers in the comparative mythology field have noted with sustained interest. It takes 72 years for the precession of the equinoxes to shift the position of the sun at the spring equinox by 1 degree against the background of the fixed stars. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis completes one full cycle every 25,920 years, moving through the 12 constellations of the zodiac at the rate of 1 degree per 72 years. One full constellation per 2,160 years. The number 72 appears in the Egyptian myth of Osiris. Set conspires with 72 accomplices to murder Osiris. It appears in the Jewish tradition. 72 elders translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek to produce the Septuagint. It appears in the Islamic tradition. 72 hours await the faithful in paradise. It appears in the number of names of God in the Kabbalistic tradition, in the number of disciples sent out by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and in the number of languages said to have been created at the Tower of Babel. The number is not religious decoration. It is an astronomical constant embedded in sacred narrative to ensure its survival. It is hidden in plain sight across every tradition that inherited the astronomical knowledge of the predecessor civilizations, waiting for a reader who knew what they were looking at. The grammar of civilizational cycling, the shared structure of rise, corruption, catastrophe, survival, and return, is not the grammar of independent cultures arriving at the same dark conclusion about human nature. It is the grammar of a single inherited understanding, distributed through every lineage of survivors from every reset, preserved in the forms most suited to each culture's particular way of remembering. The Vedic tradition preserved it in number and astronomical calculation. The Hopi preserved it in ceremony and oral narrative. The Egyptians preserved it in temple architecture and sacred text. The Sumerians preserved it in the king list and the epic poem. The Book of Enoch preserved it in the form of scripture. Each tradition held a different piece of the same map, and the map they collectively describe shows a world that has been here before, that has risen and known extraordinary things, and lost them and risen again. Not once but 6 times before the civilization currently reading these words came into existence. The question that every one of these traditions eventually turns toward is not historical, it is immediate, because the cycling framework they describe is not just a record of what happened before. It is a predictive structure, a model of where a civilization is in the sequence, based on observable indicators at any given moment. And the indicators that the Vedic, Hopi, Mayan, and Egyptian traditions all pointed toward are not pointing at a distant future. they are pointing at now, and the physical evidence that the Earth itself is producing in its magnetic field, in its sky, in the accelerating instability of the systems, is not contradicting them. It is confirming them in the language of instruments rather than prophecy, in the language of measurement rather than myth, but arriving with the precision of both at the same conclusion. Chapter 12: The Seventh Civilization and the Shape of What is Coming. Iron does not lie. The compass needle that pointed toward magnetic north in 1831, when the Scottish explorer James Clark Ross first fixed its precise position on the Boothia Peninsula in the Canadian Arctic, pointed at a location that no longer corresponds to where magnetic north is now. In the nearly 2 centuries since Ross planted his instruments in the frozen ground and made the first accurate measurement of the magnetic pole's position, that pole has moved more than 1,400 kilometers, drifting northward and westward across the Canadian Arctic at a pace that was, for most of the 20th century, slow enough to be accommodated by periodic updates to navigational charts without particular alarm. Then, around 1990, the drift accelerated. By the early 2000s, the pole was moving at approximately 55 kilometers per year, fast enough that the World Magnetic Model, the mathematical framework that underlies every GPS system, every aircraft navigation system, and every digital compass on every smartphone on Earth, required an emergency out-of-cycle update in 2019 because the pole had moved far enough from its predicted position to introduce navigational errors that exceeded acceptable tolerances in high-precision applications. The acceleration has continued. Geophysicists at institutions, including the British Geological Survey and the National Centres for Environmental Information, have been monitoring the pole's movement with increasing attention and increasing candor about the difficulty of predicting where it is going. The standard models of geomagnetic behavior, built on assumptions about the stability of the convection patterns in the Earth's outer core, have consistently underestimated the speed of the drift and have been revised repeatedly in the direction of faster movement rather than slower. The outer core's behavior, the churning of liquid iron at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Celsius, generating the magnetic field that wraps the Earth in the protective envelope that makes complex life possible, has been changing in ways that the instruments can measure, but that the models struggle to explain with full confidence. The South Atlantic anomaly is the clearest current expression of what that change looks like from the surface. A broad region centered roughly over the South Atlantic and extending across portions of South America and Southern Africa. The anomaly is a place where the Van Allen belts, the toroidal regions of magnetically trapped radiation that normally extend from roughly 1,000 to 60,000 kilometers above the Earth's surface, dip to within 200 kilometers of the ground. Within the anomaly, the radiation environment at low Earth orbit is severe enough that satellites passing through it routinely experience single-event upsets, cosmic ray particles striking electronic components with enough energy to flip a bit from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, corrupting data, triggering unexpected commands, and causing anomalies that mission controllers have learned to anticipate whenever a spacecraft enters the anomaly's boundaries. The International Space Station's computers are shut down or placed in protected mode during its passages through the anomaly. The Hubble Space Telescope has experienced thousands of data dropouts attributable to the same cause. The anomaly has been expanding, slowly, measurably, consistently, for as long as it has been monitored. 5 of the 6 resets described in this chronicle involved a significant geomagnetic component. The second reset was solar, disrupting the resonant energy systems of the second civilization through sustained extreme solar output combined with magnetic field weakening. The third reset's Pacific subsidence was driven in part by the tectonic instability that accompanies geomagnetic transitions. The fourth reset combined seismic destabilization with the geomagnetic pole shift that the Atlantean crystal network could not survive. The fifth reset's Younger Dryas impact was amplified by the magnetic field weakness that left the atmosphere less capable of deflecting the incoming fragmented comet. The sixth reset was geomagnetic directly. The collapse of the magnetic field that powered the megalithic civilization's energy systems, and the subsequent exposure of the surface to cosmic radiation levels incompatible with the civilization's continued operation. The pattern is not subtle. A civilization monitoring its own magnetic field and finding it in accelerating transition has, in the context of the hidden timeline, specific reasons to pay attention to what that transition might mean. The Carrington event of September 1859 is the named precedent, the closest historical analog the seventh civilization has produced for what a severe solar geomagnetic interaction looks like from the inside. Richard Carrington was a British amateur astronomer of considerable skill and dedication who had built a private observatory at his family's brewery estate in Red Hill, Surrey, and spent years producing a systematic record of sunspot activity that remains one of the most carefully documented observational datasets of the mid-Victorian period. On the morning of September 1st, 1859, Carrington was at his telescope projecting the sun's image onto a white screen and sketching the sunspot groups visible on the solar disk, as he did on most clear mornings, when he observed something he had never seen before and had no framework to interpret. 2 brilliant patches of white light appeared within the largest sunspot group, intensified rapidly over the course of approximately 5 minutes, and then faded. He noted the time, 11:18 in the morning, and ran to find a witness, returning to find the lights already fading. He published his observation the same day, noting that he could not account for what he had seen. 17 hours later, the consequences arrived. The magnetometers at the Kew Observatory in London, which had been recording the Earth's magnetic field continuously since 1858, went off scale. Their needles deflected so far from their normal positions that the instruments could not contain the measurement. The aurora borealis appeared as far south as the Caribbean, glowing red and green and white so brightly that people in the northeastern United States woke, believing their neighborhoods were on fire. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed simultaneously, and then, in some cases, began operating without any connection to their battery power sources. Driven entirely by the induced current flowing through the wires from the geomagnetic storm above. Telegraph operators who touched their equipment received electric shocks. Paper tape in telegraph offices caught fire. The entire global communications infrastructure of 1859, which was the telegraph network, was disabled within hours and took days to restore. The global communications infrastructure of the present is not the telegraph network of 1859. It is vastly more extensive, vastly more interconnected, and vastly more vulnerable to the kind of induced current surge that the Carrington event produced. The systems that now carry civilization's operational functions, the power grids, the internet, the satellite navigation networks, the financial transaction infrastructure, the hospital monitoring systems, the water treatment control systems, the supply chain logistics platforms, are all dependent on electronics whose sensitivity to electromagnetic interference is orders of magnitude greater than the copper wire and mechanical relays of the Victorian telegraph. A study published in 2013 by Lloyd's of London, The Insurance Market, estimated that a Carrington-level geomagnetic storm striking the Earth today would cause between 0.6 and $2.6 trillion in damage in the United States alone, primarily through the destruction of high-voltage transformers, components that take between 1 and 3 years to manufacture and that are not stockpiled in sufficient numbers to replace a significant fraction of the grid simultaneously. The study estimated that full restoration of power to the most severely affected regions could take between 4 and 10 years. 4 to 10 years without the power grid is not an inconvenience. It is a civilizational reset condition. It is the condition under which the food distribution system, which depends on refrigeration and logistics software and fuel pumps and electronic payment processing, fails. It is the condition under which the water treatment system, which depends on electrical pumping and automated chemical dosing, fails. It is the condition under which the medical system, which depends on powered equipment and refrigerated medications and electronically managed supply chains, contracts to a fraction of its current capacity. It is, in the language of the hidden timeline, the kind of infrastructure collapse that reduces a civilization to its survivors, to the people and the knowledge and the seeds and the tools that remain functional, in the absence of the systems that the civilization had come to treat as permanent. The seventh civilization has produced, in its 12,000 years of development since the Younger Dryas ended on that limestone ridge in Anatolia, an archive of knowledge and art and scientific understanding whose scale exceeds anything the previous 6 cycles left behind, or at least anything they left behind that we have found. More information has been generated in the last decade than in all of recorded human history before it. More scientific papers, more artistic works, more engineering specifications, more genomic sequences, more astronomical observations, more philosophical arguments, all of it stored in formats that depend, for their accessibility, on the continued functioning of the electronic infrastructure that the Carrington event demonstrated can be disabled in 17 hours by a star that has been disabling civilizations, in one form or another, for as long as civilizations have existed on the surface of this particular planet. The question of what survives a reset is not abstract for the seventh civilization. It is the most practical question the civilization currently faces, more practical in the long run than any of the political and economic questions that occupy most of its attention. Thoth understood this. The builders of Göbekli Tepe understood this. Utnapishtim, if the tradition is accurate, understood this with enough urgency to spend months constructing a vessel specifically designed to carry the seed of the living world through the catastrophe ahead. The understanding they shared that the most important work of the final phase of a civilizational cycle is not the continuation of the cycle's achievements, but the preservation of its knowledge for the civilization that follows, is the understanding that the seventh civilization has not yet, as an organized collective, fully internalized. Some individuals have. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in a mountain on a Norwegian Arctic island 400 kilometers from the North Pole, holds more than 1.3 million seed samples from nearly every food crop grown on Earth. A deliberate, funded, institutionally maintained archive of the agricultural knowledge that the seventh civilization inherited from the Natufians and the first farmers of the Fertile Crescent. It is preserved against the possibility of a catastrophe that destroys the distributed agricultural system currently feeding 8 billion people. The Long Now Foundation's clock of the Long Now, being constructed inside a mountain in the Texas desert, is designed to keep accurate time for 10,000 years, a monument to the idea that human civilization should think in civilizational timescales rather than electoral ones. The Voyager probes, launched in 1977 and now traveling beyond the heliopause at the edge of the solar system, carry golden records containing sounds and images of Earth, the most distant human archive in existence, a message in a bottle dropped not into an ocean, but into interstellar space, addressed to whoever finds it in whatever future exists after whatever comes next. These are the seventh civilization's equivalents of the deliberate burial at Göbekli Tepe, the acts of people who understand, consciously or intuitively, that their civilization's first obligation to the future is not conquest or accumulation, but preservation. They are isolated acts, not yet a coordinated strategy, but they exist. The instinct that produced them, the instinct to encode what matters in a form designed to last not for decades, but for cycles, is the same instinct that produced the Giza Plateau, the buried pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the Nahkel tablets, the Emerald tablet, the Vedic oral tradition, the Aboriginal songlines, the Sumerian king list. It is the most consistent feature of every civilization in this chronicle. Every one of them, at the end, reached for the most durable medium available and tried to write down what it knew. The six civilizations that preceded us did not all succeed in passing everything through. Some knowledge was lost at each reset, compressed, garbled, reduced to fragments and hints that later civilizations misread or dismissed or could not decode without the context that had been lost with it. The pattern of transmission is not a clean relay race, one civilization handing a complete baton to the next. It is more like a library that floods repeatedly. Each time, most of the books are lost, a few survive, and the next library is built partly from the survivors and partly from what the next civilization discovers on its own. They go on, never knowing what they are rediscovering and what they are finding for the first time. What the seventh civilization is currently rediscovering in its physics, in its genetics, in its archaeology, in its slowly expanding willingness to take seriously the traditions it dismissed for centuries as primitive mythology, is not new. It is old beyond the reach of any textbook. The quantum field theory that describes the physical world as fundamentally a field of vibration rather than a collection of solid objects is not a modern insight that the ancient world was too primitive to have reached. It is a rediscovery of what the second civilization encoded in the ratio of pi, what the Vedic tradition preserved in the concept of Nada Brahma, what the Hermetic tradition compressed into the first principle of the Emerald Tablet. The civilization is remembering, slowly and incompletely, what it once knew, feeling its way back toward a knowledge it carries in its oldest texts and its strangest archaeological sites and its most anomalous genetic inheritance. Whether it remembers enough and preserves enough before the next reset arrives, that is the question the hidden timeline leaves open, not as a threat, not as a prophecy, but as the same quiet challenge that every civilization in this chronicle has faced at the same point in its cycle. The challenge of taking seriously what the stone remembers, what the number encodes, what the myth preserves, what the sky is currently saying to anyone patient enough to look up and listen. The stone of the Giza Plateau is still there. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are still mostly buried, still mostly unread, still waiting in the clean rubble that the builders packed around them 11,000 years ago, with the patience of people who understood that the reader they were writing for had not yet been born. The numbers are still in the sky, moving through their cycles with the same precision they had when the first civilization encoded them in the proportions of the first sacred structure. Before the first reset, in a world whose name no living tradition has fully preserved. The cold of old stone does not diminish. Cut 10,000 years ago, or 50,000, laid by hands that knew something we are only beginning to remember, it holds the same temperature, the temperature of the deep earth, steady beneath all the ages that have passed across its surface. The weight of it is the same. The precision of its fitting is the same. Whatever was built to last has lasted, and whatever was encoded to be found is still there, in the stone, in the number, in the story told to children who told it to their children. Across every reset, across every winter, across every long return, waiting as it has always been waiting, for the civilization patient and humble enough to finally read it. The journey is complete. Rest well.